My boss grabbed my arm so hard his fingers bruised my skin. We were standing in the middle of the grand lobby of Vanguard Financial, and I was using American Sign Language to guide a lost, casually dressed older man to the elevators. "Stop wasting company time on strays," my boss hissed, his voice echoing off the polished marble walls for everyone to hear. "You are fired. Pack your desk right now." The older man did not flinch. He simply smiled, reached inside his faded corduroy jacket, and pulled out a heavy brass Platinum Founders badge. He held it up to the light, looked right at my boss, and signed a single sentence. "Actually, Todd, you are." Every high-level executive standing in that lobby absolutely froze. The color drained from Todd's face so fast he looked like he might pass out. His grip on my arm went completely slack. Before I tell you what happened the moment that badge caught the light, please take a second to like and subscribe, but only if you genuinely connect with stories about standing up for yourself. Drop a comment and let me know where you are watching from right now and what time it is there. I love reading your responses. My name is Sarah. I am 29 years old, and until that morning, I worked as an administrative coordinator. Todd was the regional manager. He is also my brother-in-law. To understand why Todd thought he had the absolute right to grab my arm and throw me out on the street in front of the entire company, you have to understand the toxic family dynamic that put me in that lobby in the first place. Growing up, I learned very quickly that love in our house was not free. My older sister Ashley was the golden child. She was beautiful, demanding, and my mother Susan worshipped the ground she walked on. When Ashley married Todd, a smooth-talking corporate climber, my mother acted like they were American royalty. I was just the family workhorse, the reliable one you call when you need something done for free. Todd got me the job at Vanguard 3 years ago, but he did not do it to be generous. He did it because he needed a loyal servant. I was doing 80% of his managerial work, staying late, skipping lunches, and crunching numbers while he played golf and collected a massive 6-figure salary. I kept my head down and did exactly what I was told because I thought that was what family did. I thought if I worked hard enough, they would finally respect me. I had no idea that my obedience was exactly what they were counting on to frame me for a crime I did not commit. My mother, Susan, had a very specific way of looking at my older sister, Ashley. It was a look reserved for fragile, priceless antiques that needed to be protected from the world. Ashley was the golden child born with perfect blonde hair and an effortless charm that could talk her out of any consequence. I was the practical one. I was the sturdy foundation built to support the beautiful mansion I was never actually allowed to live in. Growing up in our house meant understanding early on that my hard work and achievements were simply expected while Ashley's mere existence was loudly celebrated. When I graduated from college with a finance degree, my mother handed me a generic store-bought card and immediately reminded me that I needed to spend my entire weekend helping Ashley move into her new luxury apartment. When Ashley managed to hold down a basic receptionist job for 3 consecutive months, my mother threw a massive catered dinner party and invited half the neighborhood. I sat in the corner of that party drinking tap water and watching my mother parade Ashley around the room like she had just cured a major disease. The true toxic dynamic cemented itself permanently when Ashley married Todd. Todd was a smooth-talking regional manager with a designer watch collection and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. My mother was completely enchanted by him from the moment he stepped onto our front porch. She bragged to the entire congregation at our Sunday church services about her incredibly successful son-in-law. She loved the image they projected to the world. They were the wealthy, happy, successful American family living the absolute dream. But behind closed doors, I was the one secretly bleeding myself dry to keep that perfect image intact. It started with small emotional manipulations and sudden financial requests. My mother would call me on a Tuesday evening, her voice dripping with manufactured panic. "Sarah," she would say, "Ashley and Todd are in a really tight spot this month. They had an unexpected medical bill and their luxury SUV car payment is due tomorrow. You have always been so responsible with your savings. Be a good sister and help them out. Family loyalty is everything, Sarah. You know we only have each other." Because I desperately craved my mother's approval, I transferred the money without asking questions. I paid their car note, $600 straight out of my hard-earned savings account. I ate cheap canned pasta for 2 weeks to make up for the loss. The following weekend, I was scrolling through social media and saw Ashley posting a massive photo dump from a luxury wine tasting tour in Napa Valley. That was the unexpected emergency. They needed my savings to fund their extravagant vacation. I confronted my mother about it, but she instantly turned the situation back on me. "How could you be so selfish, Sarah?" She scolded, her tone turning to absolute ice. "Todd works incredibly hard at his corporate job, and your sister needs a break from managing the household. They deserve nice things. You are single and you do not have any real expenses. You should be happy to help your family thrive. That single incident became the unbreakable pattern of my life. Over the next few years, I became their personal emergency fund, their secret ATM. I paid for Ashley's emergency kitchen remodel, which miraculously turned out to be imported Italian marble countertops. I covered Todd's emergency country club membership fees because my mother convinced me he absolutely needed it to network for his corporate career. Sunday dinners at my mother's house became a weekly performance where Todd sat at the head of the table drinking expensive wine while I stood in the kitchen washing the heavy pots and pans. Every single time I tried to say no or establish a financial boundary, my mother would weaponize her affection. She would threaten to cut me out of the family entirely, telling me I was an ungrateful daughter who did not understand the true meaning of loyalty. I was terrified of being totally alone in the world, so I kept paying. I kept making myself smaller and smaller, hoping that eventually my financial sacrifices would buy the unconditional love I had always wanted. 3 years ago, my accounting firm downsized and I lost my job. I was terrified about making my rent and paying my student loans. Todd swooped in like a corporate savior, offering me an administrative coordinator position at Vanguard Financial, where he was the regional director. My mother praised him for weeks, calling him an absolute saint for taking care of his little sister-in-law. She made sure I understood how deeply indebted I was to his immense generosity. "You owe him your life, Sarah," she would say. "Never forget what he did for you." I took the job feeling a profound sense of gratitude. I thought Todd was genuinely trying to help me back on my feet during a very dark time. I did not realize he was just securing a loyal, heavily discounted employee who would never dare question his authority. The crushing reality of working for Todd hit me by the second week at Vanguard. My official job title was administrative coordinator, but my actual duties were entirely different. Todd essentially handed over 80% of his upper management workload to me. I was the one building the complex quarterly budgets. I was the one analyzing the regional market trends and writing the forecasting reports. I was the one restructuring the high net worth client portfolios. I arrived at the office at 6 in the morning when the building was still dark and rarely left before 7 at night. Meanwhile, Todd arrived at 10 in the morning, grabbed a fancy coffee, took 2-hour lunches with his buddies, and left by 4 in the afternoon to hit the golf course. He blatantly took the credit for every successful financial strategy I developed. He stood up in board meetings presenting my detailed spreadsheets as his own brilliant ideas. He collected the massive 6-figure salary and the hefty annual performance bonuses, while I earned a modest hourly wage that barely covered my basic living expenses. If I ever made a minor mistake or asked for a day off, he would lean over my desk and remind me that I was easily replaceable. He would look down at me and say, "I really stuck my neck out for you." Sarah, do not make me look bad to the executives. And standing right behind his shadow, my mother was always there. A constant voice in my ear whispering that I needed to work harder to repay his phenomenal kindness. I lived in that exhausting, inescapable cycle of workplace exploitation and family financial abuse for 3 full years. I convinced myself it was normal. I told myself that this was just what family loyalty required in modern America. I swallowed my exhaustion, forced a smile, and kept balancing Todd's books while my mother and sister drained my bank account dry. I truly believed I could just keep my head down and survive indefinitely. Then came the final Friday of the fiscal quarter. It was late afternoon and the corporate office was completely deserted. Todd had left early for a weekend ski trip in Aspen, leaving me with a massive mountain of disorganized expense reports to reconcile before the highly anticipated Monday morning executive audit. I was clicking through the regional ledger matching digital receipts to outgoing corporate transfers when my eyes caught something strange. It was a minor accounting error at first glance. Just a tiny discrepancy in the vendor payment column that most people would have scrolled right past. An invoice for $50,000 had been logged under routine office renovations, but the routing number did not match any of our approved corporate contractors. I frowned, rubbing my tired, burning eyes, and dug a little deeper into the digital archives. I assumed I had simply misfiled a digit during one of my 14-hour shifts. I thought I could just correct the typo and go home. But as I traced the routing number through the secure payment gateway, my heart began to pound heavily against my ribs. The account did not belong to a commercial construction company. The $50,000 had been quietly wired to an external offshore holding account. My breath hitched in my throat. I pulled up the previous month's records and found another mismatched invoice for an even larger amount. Then another, and another. My hands began to tremble violently as I scrolled back through 3 years of regional financial data. The minor error was not an error at all. It was a single, loose thread. And as I pulled on it, the entire fabric of Todd's pristine regional budget began to completely unravel. revealing a massive, terrifying black hole of missing funds. Worst of all, I saw my own digital signature stamped on every single approval form. I sat frozen in the silent, darkening office, staring at the glowing monitor, realizing that my unshakable family loyalty had just triggered a chain reaction that was guaranteed to destroy my entire livelihood and send me straight to federal prison. The sudden announcement of a massive, comprehensive internal audit hit Vanguard Financial like an absolute shockwave. Normally, our regional branch operated with very little oversight from the corporate headquarters. We submitted our quarterly reports, the executives upstairs nodded, and everyone went about their daily business. But this time, the atmosphere was entirely different. A cold, sterile email from the chief financial officer dictated that a team of external auditors would be arriving in exactly 10 days to review every single ledger expense account and vendor contract from the past 3 years. The entire floor went into a state of high alert, but nobody panicked quite like Todd. For a man who usually swaggered through the office in tailored suits and spent his afternoons practicing his golf swing in the break room, the transformation was incredibly jarring. His polished corporate mask melted away almost overnight. He started arriving at dawn and locking himself inside his corner office. He snapped viciously at the receptionists. He paced the hallways with a manic, sweaty energy that made everyone around him deeply uncomfortable. I honestly thought he was just stressed about defending his regional budget to the higher-ups. I was incredibly naive to believe that was his only problem. The real nightmare began on a Friday evening just as the sun was setting over the city. By 6 o'clock, the office had completely emptied out. I was packing up my bag at my desk, eager to go home and finally get some rest after a grueling week of covering all of his normal managerial duties. That was when Todd emerged from his office. He was carrying 3 massive, heavy cardboard storage boxes packed to the brim with physical receipts, bank statements, and loose vendor invoices. He dropped them directly onto my desk with a loud thud that made me jump out of my chair. He leaned over my workspace. His breath smelled like stale coffee and sheer panic. He told me I needed to cancel whatever weekend plans I had made. He said the corporate auditors were demanding a completely reconciled budget by Monday morning, and our digital records were a complete mess. He instructed me to manually cross-reference every single physical receipt in those 3 boxes with our digital financial database. Then he gave me the specific instruction that should have sent me running out the front door. He told me to log into the main financial server using my own personal administrative credentials. He claimed his managerial account was temporarily locked due to a system password reset glitch, and he absolutely needed me to input the corrections directly under my name. He patted my shoulder with a heavy, clammy hand and told me he knew he could count on his favorite sister-in-law to save the day. He framed it as a desperate family favor. He promised he would make it up to me as soon as the audit was over. I was physically exhausted. My eyes burned from staring at spreadsheets all day, but I simply nodded. I always nodded. I sat back down in my chair, turned my monitor back on, and typed in my personal password. The office grew pitch black outside the tall glass windows. The only sound on the entire floor was the steady humming of the air conditioning and the rapid clicking of my keyboard. For the first 2 hours, the task seemed tedious but relatively normal. I matched vendor payments to office supplies, catered executive lunches, and standard building maintenance fees. But as I dug deeper into the third quarter expenditures, the numbers completely stopped making sense. I found a massive, glaring gap in the regional operating budget. At first, I assumed I had simply transposed a number or missed a specific page of invoices buried in the cardboard boxes. I cleared my digital calculator and ran the entire sequence again from the very beginning. The result was exactly the same. I pulled the master ledger and compared it line by line against the approved corporate funding allocations. $150,000 was completely unaccounted for. It was not a simple rounding error. It was not a misplaced decimal point. It was a massive, gaping wound in our finances. Entire lines of funding meant for regional expansion had simply vanished into thin air. There were huge outgoing wire transfers listed in the master digital file, with absolutely no corresponding vendor invoices in the physical boxes Todd had just given me. My stomach twisted into a tight, painful knot. I printed the discrepancy report, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold the warm paper coming out of the machine. I walked down the dark, quiet hallway to Todd's office. His door was slightly ajar, and he was sitting behind his large mahogany desk, staring blankly at his computer screen. I stepped inside and placed the printed report right over his keyboard. I pointed to the missing $150,000 and asked him exactly what happened to the company money. I expected him to look confused. I expected him to help me find the missing paperwork or explain a complicated accounting rule I did not understand. Instead, his head snapped up and his eyes went completely dead. He stood up slowly, towering over me in the dim light. He did not offer a single explanation. He immediately went on the offensive. He slammed his hand flat on the desk and accused me of being entirely incompetent. He told me I was terrible at my job, and that I clearly did not know how to run a basic reconciliation. When I pushed back, pointing out that the digital wire transfers had no corporate destination attached to them, his voice dropped into a vicious, threatening whisper. He leaned in so close I could feel the angry heat radiating off his face. He told me that I was the one currently logged into the secure system. He reminded me that my digital signature was now permanently stamped on every single file I had touched that night. He completely flipped the narrative, twisting reality until my head spun. He said if those numbers did not balance perfectly by Monday morning, the corporate auditors would look at the server logs, see my login credentials, and immediately assume I was the one stealing company funds. I stood there paralyzed by shock and mounting fear. I told him I would not cover up missing money. I told him I would go straight to the board of directors and tell them exactly what he forced me to do. Todd laughed. It was the cold, cruel sound that echoed terribly in the empty room. He asked me who the corporate executives were going to believe. A highly decorated regional director with a flawless corporate record or a low-level administrative coordinator who only got her job because her family begged for a favor. He told me I was absolutely nothing without him. He threatened to fire me immediately, destroy my professional reputation, and make sure I never worked in the finance sector ever again. Then he played his final, most devastating card. He warned me that if I blew this out of proportion and cost him his job, my mother and my sister would utterly destroy my life. He said they would never forgive me for ruining his career and making my sister suffer. He pointed a trembling finger toward the office door and ordered me to get back to my desk. He told me to make the numbers balance by any means necessary, or I would be the one going to federal prison. I walked back down that dark hallway feeling completely trapped, terrified, and utterly betrayed. I sat down at my desk, staring at the glowing screen, the horrific truth washing over me. My own brother-in-law had intentionally set me up to take the fall for a massive financial crime, and my blind loyalty to my family was the exact weapon he was using to dig my grave. Sunday dinners at my mother's house used to be the one fragile anchor I had left in the world. I drove to her suburban home that afternoon, craving the familiar scent of roasted chicken and the desperate hope that someone in my family would actually listen to me. I was terrified. Todd had essentially threatened my freedom just 48 hours prior. I needed my mother. I needed her to act like a mother. I pulled into the wide driveway parking far behind Ashley's gleaming white luxury sport utility vehicle. Walking up the front steps, my hands were sweating. I practiced exactly what I was going to say in my head. I would explain that Todd was in serious trouble at the office and that he was asking me to do something highly illegal. I turned the brass knob and stepped into the foyer. The moment I crossed the threshold, I knew something was horribly wrong. There was no food on the table. There was no smell of cooking coming from the kitchen. The house was dead quiet. My mother, Susan, was sitting rigidly at the head of the long, formal dining table with my sister Ashley seated directly beside her. Todd was conspicuously absent. My mother patted the empty wooden chair across from them. She instructed me to sit down. Her voice lacked any trace of maternal warmth or welcome. It sounded like a corporate summons. Ashley did not even bother to look up at me. She was completely absorbed in inspecting her freshly manicured nails, projecting an aura of bored impatience. My mother folded her hands together, resting them on the polished wood, and immediately dropped the bomb. She stated that Todd was facing a temporary business shortfall at the office. She called it a minor liquidity issue, repeating the sterile financial jargon like a perfectly rehearsed script. She claimed the upcoming corporate audit was putting unnecessary pressure on him, and that he needed an immediate cash injection to balance his regional books before the executives arrived on Monday morning. Then my mother looked me dead in the eye and delivered the most insane demand I had ever heard. She told me I needed to go to the bank first thing Monday morning and apply for a $50,000 personal loan. I actually stopped breathing for a second. The air completely left my lungs. I stared at the two women sitting across from me, entirely dumbfounded by their audacity. $50,000. I reminded them that I was an administrative coordinator. I barely made enough money to cover my monthly rent and basic groceries. I told them my credit score was the absolute only decent financial asset I possessed, and I was not going to ruin it. That is exactly when the trap violently snapped shut around me. Ashley finally looked up from her hands and scoffed loudly. She slammed her palm on the table and accused me of being completely selfish. She yelled that Todd had stuck his neck out to get me that job at Vanguard Financial when I was unemployed and pathetic. My mother immediately chimed in, her voice rising in a pitch of absolute righteous indignation. She reminded me of all the imaginary sacrifices Todd had made to keep me afloat. She said this was a dire family emergency and that I owed my brother-in-law my life. They framed it as my ultimate duty. They said taking out a high-interest unsecured personal loan was the very least I could do to repay the immense debt I owed them. I felt a cold, sick realization spreading rapidly through my chest. They were not asking me to help cover an innocent accounting mistake. They were demanding I finance Todd's criminal cover-up. They wanted me to take on a massive personal debt to hide the missing corporate funds I had discovered on Friday night. I planted my hands firmly on the edge of the dining table and found a deep reservoir of strength I did not know I possessed. I looked directly at my mother and said absolutely not. I told them I was not taking out a fraudulent loan to cover up whatever financial mess Todd had created at the company. My mother stood up so fast her heavy wooden chair scraped violently against the hardwood floor. Her face twisted into a dark, ugly mask of pure disgust. She pointed a trembling finger straight at the front door. She told me that if I did not walk into that bank on Monday and secure the money to save my sister's husband, I was no longer her daughter. She declared with absolute icy conviction that I would be entirely dead to them. Ashley jumped in, calling me a jealous, bitter failure who just wanted to see her perfect marriage destroyed. They screamed at me, demanding I leave their sight immediately and not come back until I figured out how to be a loyal member of this family. I walked out of that house without saying another word. I got into my old car and slammed the door shut. My hands gripped the steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white as tears of profound grief and utter betrayal streamed down my face. The reality was suffocating. My own mother and sister were perfectly willing to destroy my financial future and potentially my freedom just to protect a thief. They did not care if I drowned as long as Ashley got to keep her perfect life. But as I sat there alone in the quiet suburban street, the overwhelming grief suddenly burned away. It was swiftly replaced by a sharp, burning suspicion that cut through the emotional fog. If Todd was desperate enough to send his wife and mother-in-law to extort $50,000 in cash from me right now, then the digital trail I had seen on Friday was only the tip of a massive iceberg. The missing $150,000 was just the beginning. I wiped my eyes and shoved the car into drive. I did not go back to my cramped apartment to cry. Instead, I turned my car toward the downtown financial district. It was nearly midnight, but I was driving straight back to the empty, towering offices of Vanguard Financial. I was going to rip apart those digital files Todd had tried to force me to alter, and I was not leaving that building until I uncovered every single buried secret. The glass doors of Vanguard Financial slid open with a hollow mechanical hum. At midnight, the corporate headquarters felt completely alien. Gone was the bustling energy of ambitious brokers and ringing phones. It was replaced by a heavy, suffocating silence that amplified the sound of my own frantic heartbeat. I bypassed the main security desk using the after-hours access card Todd had given me years ago, so I could run his ridiculous weekend errands. Walking down the darkened corridor to my cubicle, every shadow seemed to stretch and contort. My hands were practically vibrating as I woke my computer from sleep mode. The harsh blue light of the monitor illuminated the empty floor, casting an eerie glow over the sprawling rows of vacant desks. I pulled up the regional ledger again, but this time I was not looking for a simple clerical error. I was hunting for a ghost. I closed my eyes for a brief second, taking a deep breath to steady my shaking fingers. If I was going to uncover exactly what my brother-in-law was hiding, I had to stop thinking like a terrified little sister and start thinking like a forensic auditor. Todd always wildly underestimated my intelligence. He treated me like a glorified secretary because my official title was administrative coordinator. He conveniently forgot that I had spent years studying advanced financial systems and complex data analytics before an industry downturn left me desperate for a basic paycheck. I knew exactly how to track phantom transactions. I bypassed the standard visual dashboards that the executives used and pulled the raw data logs directly from the back-end server. I isolated the exact dates of the missing $150,000. The numbers cascaded down my screen in dense columns of green and white text. I sorted the data by external routing origins and cross-referenced them against our approved corporate vendor list. Within 20 minutes, the chaotic data began to form a terrifyingly clear pattern. This was absolutely no accident. The missing funds had been meticulously sliced into dozens of smaller automated wire transfers. They were specifically designed to fall just a few $100s below the internal corporate audit threshold. Todd had scheduled these illicit transactions to execute during late-night server maintenance windows so they would bypass the daily automated security flags. I watched in horror as fake consulting fees and bogus property maintenance charges were repeatedly approved under my employee identification number. He was skimming the corporate expansion budget right off the top and washing it through dummy vendor accounts. My throat went completely dry. The metallic taste of adrenaline flooded my mouth. If he was running a scheduled algorithm to siphon regional funds, he could not have just started doing this during the current quarter. A scheme this sophisticated required extensive testing and months of slow escalation. I expanded my search parameters beyond the current fiscal year, extending the query all the way back to the exact month I was originally hired. I wrote a quick custom script to search the entire corporate network for the specific digital footprint left by those masked wire transfers. The server ground heavily for a long, agonizing minute. Then a hidden subdirectory populated on my screen. It was buried deep within a restricted vendor archive masked under a folder labeled with a meaningless string of random alphanumeric characters. I bypassed the basic password protection Todd had foolishly relied on and cracked the folder open. The true magnitude of his betrayal hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The master spreadsheet hidden inside was a meticulously detailed roadmap of grand larceny. The spreadsheet contained detailed tabs for offshore holding accounts, luxury real estate down payments, and high-yield anonymous investments. Line by line, column by column, the stolen amounts compounded. It was not just $150,000. Over the past 3 years, my arrogant brother-in-law had systematically embezzled more than $2.5 million from Vanguard Financial. $2.5 million. And he had deliberately routed every single one of those fraudulent approval requests through my administrative account. He had engineered the entire theft to leave a permanent digital trail pointing directly at me. I sat there grasping the edge of my desk, trying to force oxygen into my lungs. The room started to spin. He was genuinely going to let me take the fall for a multi-million-dollar federal crime while he walked away completely clean. I needed to know exactly where the stolen money went. I pulled the receiving routing numbers from the hidden spreadsheet and ran them through a public state corporate registry database. Thieves always try to hide their tracks behind anonymous shell corporations, but Todd was incredibly arrogant and surprisingly lazy. He believed no one would ever look close enough to connect the dots. He assumed his position as regional manager made him entirely untouchable. The registry search loaded, displaying a recently formed limited liability company named Horizon Coastal Ventures. The primary business address listed was a generic post office box, located in an incredibly wealthy Florida zip code, but it was the ownership registry that completely shattered whatever fragile remaining hope I had left for my family. The managing directors of the Shell Corporation were clearly printed on the screen. The names stared back at me in cold, hard, unforgiving text. Ashley Sterling and Susan Miller, my older sister and my own mother. I remembered my mother bragging at church about the brilliant real estate investments her son-in-law was managing for her. I remembered Ashley complaining about the stressful remodeling of her second vacation home. It all made sickening sense now. The same two women who had spent their entire evening screaming at me demanding I take out a personal loan to cover a fake business shortfall were the sole registered beneficiaries of the stolen corporate funds. They were not innocent bystanders. They were not naive family members blinded by Todd's success. They were actively using my name and my freedom to finance their luxury vacations and their brand new beachfront real estate. The sudden realization was absolute agony. I was entirely alone. I sat in the harsh glow of the computer monitor, completely paralyzed by the sheer magnitude of the betrayal. The discovery of the offshore shell company registered to my mother and sister was devastating, but I needed to know exactly how Todd planned to pull off this massive deception. I navigated away from the secure banking portal and opened his corporate email client. Todd had carelessly left his administrative profile fully synced to the desktop application. I clicked into his outbox, finding nothing unusual before shifting my cursor over to his drafts folder. There was a single message sitting there saved just 3 hours ago. The subject line read, "Urgent preliminary audit findings confidential." The email was addressed directly to the lead corporate auditor in New York. I began to read the text and my blood ran absolutely cold. Todd had written a masterful piece of corporate fiction. He claimed that during a routine end-of-quarter review, he had uncovered highly suspicious routing anomalies originating from a lower-level administrative terminal. He wrote that he had immediately restricted my network access to prevent further damage. He painted a detailed, horrific picture of me as a deeply disgruntled, financially unstable employee who felt severely underpaid and bitter. He fabricated a complete narrative claiming I had abused my administrative privileges to quietly funnel corporate expansion money into private accounts. He even went as far as to include falsified performance reviews attached to the draft. Documents I had never seen before outlining a history of erratic behavior and insubordination. He wrote that he was heartbroken to discover his own sister-in-law had betrayed his trust, but that his loyalty to Vanguard Financial forced him to report the crime. He was officially handing me over to the corporate wolves on a silver platter. But the absolute worst part was not the drafted email itself. Attached to the message was a compressed digital folder containing manipulated bank statements. Todd had altered the routing histories to make it look like the missing funds were being briefly bounced through a dummy account connected to my personal checking before disappearing overseas. I opened the folder to examine the forged documents and found something else hidden at the very bottom of the file list. It was a mistake, a careless error made by an arrogant man rushing to cover his tracks. It was a screenshot of a group text message thread saved as an image file. He had probably taken it to use as leverage against his own wife just in case things went south. The messages were between Todd, my sister Ashley, and my mother Susan. The timestamps were from earlier that exact same week. Ashley had written a message complaining about the stress of closing on a beachfront property in Florida. She asked Todd if he had managed to move the rest of the funds from the corporate account so they could finalize the luxury purchase. Todd replied that the final wire transfer was complete, but that the corporate audit had been unexpectedly moved up. He told them he was going to have to execute the contingency plan using Sarah tonight. Then my mother replied, the woman who had given birth to me, the woman I had desperately tried to please my entire life. She wrote a message so incredibly callous it physically took my breath away. She told Todd to make absolutely certain the paper trail pointed entirely to me. She typed out the words stating that I did not have the money for a decent lawyer and that I would inevitably take a plea deal if the federal prosecutors threatened me with a long trial. She told him to just protect the Florida house at all costs. She said I was tough and I would survive prison, but they could not afford to lose this incredible real estate opportunity. I read those horrific words over and over again until the glowing white text blurred into a meaningless smear. She would take a plea deal, just protect the house. They knew exactly what they were doing. This was not a panicked last-minute cover-up. They had been intentionally and meticulously planning to sacrifice my freedom for months. My mother and my sister were perfectly willing to let me rot in a federal prison cell for a decade, so they could sip expensive wine on a luxury balcony overlooking the ocean. I had spent my entire life trying to earn their love. I had paid their bills, picked up their messes, and swallowed their endless verbal abuse, hoping that one day I would finally be enough for them. And this was my reward. I was nothing but a convenient human shield. The concept of family loyalty was just a psychological leash they used to keep me compliant until they needed a sacrificial lamb. The profound grief that had haunted me for 29 years evaporated in a single heartbeat. It was instantly replaced by a cold, calculating, and absolute rage. I was done crying. I was done making myself small. If they wanted to play a high-stakes game with my life and my freedom, they were going to learn exactly how smart the family scapegoat actually was. I reached into my bag and pulled out a high-capacity flash drive I kept for backing up my daily work files. I jammed it into the side of the computer tower and immediately started copying everything. I dragged the offshore ledgers, the shell company registration documents, the drafted email to the auditors, and the horrific text messages into a hidden secure folder. I needed an airtight shadow file. I needed irrefutable proof that I was the victim of a massive conspiracy. The progress bar on the screen popped up showing 80% complete. The estimated time remaining was 70 long seconds. I gripped the edge of the mahogany desk, my eyes darting frantically between the slow loading screen and the dark hallway outside the glass walls of the office. The building was supposed to be completely deserted until Monday morning, but then the heavy, oppressive silence of the empty floor was shattered by a sharp mechanical click. The main security door at the far end of the corridor had just been unlocked. Heavy, confident footsteps began to echo against the polished tile floor. It was a distinctive, arrogant stride I recognized instantly. Todd had not stayed in Aspen for his luxury ski trip. He had come back. He had returned to the office in the dead of night to make absolutely sure his sacrificial lamb was blindly following his orders and changing the files. The progress bar crawled to 90%. The footsteps grew louder and faster, turning the corner into my specific corridor. I could hear the jingle of his car keys echoing off the walls. I had less than 10 seconds before he walked through that door and caught me holding the digital key to his entire criminal empire. I hovered my shaking hand over the keyboard, my heart hammering a frantic, terrifying rhythm against my ribs, desperately praying the transfer would finish before he saw the screen. The digital progress bar on my monitor crawled to 99%. Just as the heavy glass door of my department swung open, my heart hammered a violent rhythm against my ribs. I yanked the small silver flash drive from the side of the computer tower a fraction of a second before the progress window vanished. I shoved the drive deep into my coat pocket just as Todd stepped around the corner of my cubicle. The oppressive scent of his expensive designer cologne hit me before he even spoke. "What exactly are you doing, Sarah?" he demanded. His voice was sharp, cutting through the quiet office like a whip. His eyes darted aggressively from my face to the glowing computer screen and back again. He crossed his arms over his chest, trying to physically intimidate me by invading my small workspace. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to confront him. I wanted to scream that I knew exactly what he was doing. I wanted to throw the massive offshore theft in his face and tell him I knew my own mother and sister were in on the scheme. But I knew that if I showed even an ounce of defiance right now, I would lose my only advantage. I had to swallow my absolute rage and give him exactly what he expected to see. The weak, terrified, and incredibly compliant family scapegoat. I forced my shoulders to slump. I let my hands shake visibly as I gestured toward the massive piles of disorganized receipts he had dumped on my desk earlier. I made my voice tremble, imitating the overwhelmed, confused administrative assistant he believed me to be. "I cannot make it work, Todd," I whispered, letting a fake tear well up in the corner of my eye. "The numbers are just too big. There are too many vendor files and the external accounts are completely confusing. I have been trying for hours, but none of the third quarter columns are balancing. I just do not understand the high-level corporate routing systems." Todd stared at me for a long, agonizing moment. I held my breath, terrified he would notice the subtle, rapid blinking of the hard drive indicator light. But then a sickeningly smug smile spread slowly across his face. The deep suspicion in his eyes evaporated instantly, replaced by pure, suffocating arrogance. He truly believed I was just too stupid to comprehend the massive financial crime he was committing right under my nose. He let out a heavy, dramatic sigh, acting like a long-suffering boss dealing with an incompetent subordinate. He leaned his hip against my desk, invading my personal space. "Listen to me, Sarah," he said, his tone dripping with thick condescension. "This is exactly why you are just an administrative coordinator. You do not have the head for high-level financial strategy. It is incredibly complicated stuff. Do not worry your pretty little head about the missing vendor discrepancies. I will handle the complicated math. You just process the basic supply receipts and I will draft a finalized summary sheet for you. All you have to do is electronically sign your name at the bottom before the auditors arrive on Monday morning." I nodded rapidly, pretending to be incredibly relieved by his fake generosity. "Thank you, Todd," I stammered, keeping my eyes fixed firmly on my keyboard. "I promise I will sign whatever you need. I just want this audit to be over." His smile faded into a tight, cruel line. "You better sign it, Sarah," he warned, his voice dropping into a menacing whisper. "Because if you cause any problems this weekend, your sister will lose her new house. Your mother will be utterly devastated. And I will personally make sure the executives at Vanguard Financial ruin your miserable little life. Do we understand each other?" I nodded once more, entirely silent. He gave the desk one final hard tap with his knuckles before turning around and walking away. I sat completely frozen in my chair, listening to the rhythmic clicking of his expensive leather shoes echoing down the hallway until the heavy glass door shut behind him. Once I was entirely alone, the facade finally dropped. My hands stopped shaking and my spine straightened. Todd had given me an ultimatum, but he had also unknowingly given me the one thing I desperately needed: time. He dropped his guard because his massive ego could not process the idea that I might actually be smarter than him. I pulled the flash drive from my coat pocket. The metal was still warm from the computer tower. I had the raw evidence of his $2.5 million theft. But as I stared at the dark office around me, a harsh reality settled over me. I could not just walk into the Human Resources Department on Monday morning and hand them this drive. Vanguard Financial was a notoriously political corporate environment. Todd played golf every single weekend with the Vice President of Human Resources. He drank expensive scotch with the regional directors. He had spent the last 3 years building a solid wall of powerful allies in middle management while actively isolating me. If I walked into HR as a low-level administrative coordinator accusing their golden boy of massive offshore embezzlement, they would absolutely crush me. They would spin the narrative immediately. They would claim I was a disgruntled, erratic employee who did not understand complex business transactions. Todd would use his fabricated performance reviews to paint me as unstable, and my own family would gladly back up his malicious lies. I realized in that quiet, dark room that exposing a crime of this magnitude required much more than just a stolen spreadsheet. It required an absolute, airtight, impenetrable legal defense. I needed to build a shadow file so incredibly devastating and mathematically flawless that no corporate executive, no matter how corrupt, could possibly ignore it. I needed to document every single timestamp, every forged signature, and every hidden communication. I had spent my entire life playing by their rules, letting them dictate my worth and my reality. But the game had fundamentally changed. They thought I was going to quietly march to the slaughterhouse to protect their luxury lifestyle. They had no idea I was about to meticulously dismantle their entire world brick by stolen brick. The very next morning, I walked into a modest brick building in downtown Seattle to meet with two people who would become my absolute lifelines. I had spent the entire weekend researching top-tier professionals who specialized in corporate fraud and whistleblower protection. I sat across a heavy oak table from an employment attorney named Robert and a razor-sharp forensic accountant named Jessica. I handed over a printed summary of the digital records I had found on the Vanguard financial servers. Robert listened intently with his hands folded while Jessica meticulously scanned the numbers. When I finished explaining my brother-in-law's incredibly malicious setup and my own family's deeply sick involvement, I held my breath. I was terrified they would think I was crazy or making it all up. Instead, Jessica looked up and told me I had exceptional instincts for catching corporate theft. Robert slid a thick retainer agreement across the desk. It was an astronomical fee. I had to drain my entire emergency fund and max out 2 personal credit cards just to secure their professional services, but I did not hesitate for a single second. I signed the contract knowing that my personal freedom was worth every last penny to my name. Robert handed me a tiny digital audio recorder small enough to clip seamlessly beneath the collar of my work blouse. He gave me very strict instructions on how to legally document conversations in our state to ensure the evidence would hold up in a federal courtroom. For the next 3 days, I played the most exhausting and terrifying role of my entire life. I wore that hidden microphone every single hour I was awake. At the office, I perfectly maintained the facade of the overwhelmed, terrified administrative coordinator. When Todd approached my desk to aggressively remind me to adjust the quarterly discrepancies, I discreetly pressed the hidden record button. I captured crystal-clear audio of him explicitly instructing me to bypass standard corporate security protocols. I recorded him directly threatening my career if I refused to digitally forge the vendor approvals he desperately needed to satisfy the upcoming corporate audit. But the most damning evidence came from my own mother and sister. On Wednesday evening, I stopped by my mother's suburban house under the guise of dropping off some misdirected mail. Ashley was sitting on the living room couch, casually browsing through luxury furniture catalogs on her expensive tablet. I carefully steered the conversation toward my extreme anxiety about the Vanguard audit. I acted incredibly scared, pleading for their maternal and sisterly advice. Ashley rolled her eyes and told me on tape to stop being such a dramatic burden. She explicitly stated that the offshore money was already safely secured in their Florida holding company, and that I just needed to take the fall like a good sister so she could finish paying for her imported pool tiles. My mother chimed in right on cue, ordering me to sign whatever Todd put in front of me because my temporary discomfort was a small price to pay for their brand new beachfront mansion. I walked out to my car with my heart pounding heavily against my ribs, clutching a device that held the absolute destruction of their entire criminal scheme. While I was gathering audio confessions during the day, my nights were dedicated to building an impenetrable fortress of financial evidence. Working under Jessica's expert guidance, I covertly mapped the entire Vanguard regional network architecture. I used encrypted external hard drives to meticulously clone the server data during my staggered lunch breaks when Todd was out playing golf with his executive buddies. I was terrified of being caught by the IT department, but the sheer adrenaline kept me intensely focused. I cross-referenced every single fraudulent wire transfer Todd had authorized over the past 3 years. I traced the precise flow of corporate capital from the Vanguard operating budget directly into the Horizon Coastal Ventures shell company. From there, the money trail split perfectly, illuminating my family's unimaginable greed. I matched the exact dates and dollar amounts of the stolen corporate funds to Ashley's lavish lifestyle upgrades and my mother's rapidly inflating private bank accounts. I created a master digital directory organizing the forged signatures, the fake vendor invoices, the audio recordings, and the undeniable offshore banking links into one completely watertight portfolio. I named it the Shadow File. It was no longer just a loose collection of suspicious receipts. It was an absolute mathematical certainty. I had built a flawless legal weapon capable of taking down a highly connected regional manager and sending my toxic family to federal prison. I finally felt a massive surge of genuine power, replacing the decades of deep-seated fear and obedience. By Thursday morning, I felt incredibly prepared for the battle ahead. The corporate audit team was officially scheduled to arrive from New York on Monday, giving me plenty of time to finalize my legal strategy with Robert and Jessica over the weekend. I walked into the Vanguard lobby holding my morning coffee, feeling a strange sense of profound calm. I rode the elevator up to the regional suite, ready to play the obedient scapegoat for just 2 more days. The metal doors slid open and my illusion of safety instantly shattered. The entire corporate floor was in a state of absolute total chaos. Senior executives were frantically rushing down the hallways carrying stacks of thick financial binders. Junior analysts were practically sprinting between cubicles with completely terrified expressions. I grabbed a passing coworker and asked what on earth was happening. She looked at me with wide, panicked eyes and whispered that the corporate auditors had decided to run a surprise early inspection. They were not coming on Monday. They had literally just walked into the building and were currently setting up a secure war room on the top floor. Before I could even process the massive shift in the timeline, a heavy hand clamped down violently on my shoulder. I spun around to find Todd standing right behind me. His face was pale and drenched in a cold, terrified sweat. His eyes were wild with sheer desperation. He leaned down, his voice a frantic, venomous hiss telling me the audit is happening right now. He grabbed my arm, pulling me forcefully toward his private office. He told me we are completely out of time and I was going to sign the final confession document today, or he swore to ruin my life before the auditors even finished their morning coffee. Todd shoved me through the heavy glass door of his corner office and slammed it shut so hard the blinds rattled violently against the window panes. He immediately reached up and twisted the deadbolt. That sharp metallic click echoed like a gunshot in the tense, suffocating silence of the room. Outside those transparent walls, the corporate auditors from New York were already swarming our floor. Hours ahead of schedule, you could see senior executives pacing nervously in the corridors, clutching thick binders of financial reports. Inside the office, the air was thick with the scent of Todd's panicked sweat and brewing hostility. He did not offer me a seat. Instead, he marched behind his massive mahogany desk, snatched a manila folder from the top of a disorganized pile, and slapped a single sheet of paper down onto the polished wood. He grabbed a heavy silver pen and shoved it across the desk toward me. His eyes were completely bloodshot and darting wildly around the room, as if the corporate executives might crash through the ceiling at any given second. He commanded me to sign the paper immediately, claiming it was just a routine human resources protocol to temporarily satisfy the audit team, while he sorted out the real numbers behind closed doors. I forced my hands to shake realistically as I reached out and picked up the document. The bold heading at the top read Performance Improvement Plan, but as my eyes scanned the dense corporate jargon in the body paragraphs, a deep, terrifying chill settled into my bones. This was absolutely not a standard corrective action form. Todd had drafted a masterful, legally binding confession of grand larceny. The document explicitly stated that I, acting independently and without any managerial oversight, had intentionally bypassed internal security protocols to misappropriate regional funds for personal use. It contained meticulously crafted paragraphs admitting to gross financial negligence, unauthorized wire transfers, and a complete failure to uphold the basic fiduciary standards of Vanguard Financial. My thumb discreetly brushed the seam of my blouse, pressing the small concealed button of the digital audio recorder my lawyer had given me. I felt a tiny vibration against my collarbone, confirming the device was actively capturing every single sound in the room. I needed him to say the quiet part out loud. I needed the explicit proof that he was forcing me to take the fall. I looked up at him, letting my voice crack with manufactured terror. I told him I could not possibly put my name on a document that accused me of stealing company capital. I begged him to explain why my signature was necessary for an executive review. I asked him what would happen to me if the auditors actually believed I took the money and handed this fake confession over to the police. Todd slammed both of his hands onto the desk, leaning his entire body weight toward me. The veins in his neck were visibly bulging against his expensive silk collar. He told me to stop acting like a dramatic idiot. He insisted that because my administrative login credentials were tied to the missing transfers, the auditors were already going to flag my account anyway. He spun a ridiculous web of desperate lies, claiming that if I signed this confession, he could use his regional authority to quietly sweep the issue under the rug as a simple training failure. He promised me he would protect me from any criminal charges if I just played along and trusted him. I took a step back, shaking my head slowly. I deliberately pushed him closer to the edge. I asked him directly why the money was missing in the first place and why my own sister would allow him to throw me to the wolves. I told him I knew the funds were not just missing, but entirely gone, and I absolutely refused to go to jail for a corporate theft I did not commit. The fragile mask of the supportive brother-in-law completely shattered. His face twisted into a dark, ugly expression of pure, unadulterated rage. He stepped around the massive desk, backing me up against the locked door so I had nowhere to run. He pointed a trembling, furious finger mere inches from my face. He stopped pretending there was any sort of corporate misunderstanding. He looked me dead in the eyes and delivered the exact words I needed to secure my total freedom. "If you do not take the hit for this budget gap," he snarled, his voice a harsh, venomous whisper, "Ashley and I will lose the new beachfront house. We will lose absolutely everything we have built, and Susan will make sure you never speak to this family again. You will be entirely dead to your own mother, Sarah. You owe us this sacrifice. Now pick up the pen and sign the damn paper." The sheer cruelty of his statement hung heavily in the air between us. He had just voluntarily confessed to the embezzlement, the luxury real estate purchases, and the coordinated family extortion. All of it was now permanently captured in crystal-clear audio on a device hidden less than 2 inches from his mouth. He was completely convinced that the threat of losing my mother's conditional love was more than enough to make me willingly walk into a federal prison cell. He truly believed my lifelong conditioning as the family scapegoat would override my basic instinct for self-preservation. I stared back at him, keeping my expression perfectly terrified, while a profound sense of absolute victory surged through my veins. The audio file was complete. I had the smoking gun that would destroy his entire defense. Now I just needed to secure my physical escape from his locked office before the corporate auditors demanded to see the finalized files. The heavy glass door of Todd's corner office suddenly beeped. The security system had been remotely overridden by the front desk. A junior analyst poked his head into the room, nervously announcing that the lead auditor from New York needed to speak with the regional manager immediately. Todd cursed under his breath. He shot me a venomous glare, pointing at the fabricated confession letter sitting on his desk. He ordered me to stay right there and sign it before he returned. But the exact moment his expensive leather shoes disappeared down the hallway, I grabbed the document and bolted. I sprinted toward the main lobby of Vanguard Financial. I needed to escape the suffocating walls of his office before my panic attack became entirely real. The reception area was a madhouse of ringing phones and frantic executives, but I managed to slip into a quiet alcove near the glass elevators. I pressed my back against the cool wall, clutching the fake performance plan. My heart was thudding so violently against my ribs I thought it might shatter the bone. The hidden digital recorder beneath my blouse was still running silently, capturing the chaotic hum of the corporate crisis unfolding around me. I closed my eyes, praying for just 1 minute of peace to gather my thoughts and plan my next move. That fragile moment of silence was violently interrupted by the sharp clicking of low heels on the polished marble floor. I opened my eyes and my blood ran absolutely cold. Marching straight past the bewildered security guards was my mother, Susan. She carried a brown paper takeout bag, projecting the utterly false image of a caring mother bringing lunch to her hardworking family. But her face told an entirely different story. Her jaw was locked tight and her eyes swept across the crowded lobby with the predatory intensity of a hungry hawk hunting a field mouse. Todd must have texted her in a complete panic the second the corporate auditors arrived early. He knew I was hesitating and he had called in his ultimate weapon to break my spirit. When her sharp, angry gaze finally landed on me, huddled in the alcove, her fake maternal smile dropped entirely. She did not say hello or ask how my morning was going. She marched directly toward me, grabbed my upper arm with a painful, pinching grip, and yanked me forcefully behind a large decorative marble pillar, where the security cameras could not clearly see us. She shoved the brown paper bag into my chest with enough force to make me stumble backward. She leaned in so incredibly close I could smell the stale coffee and sharp peppermints on her breath. Her voice was a low, furious hiss that cut straight through the background noise of the busy lobby. She demanded to know why I was standing out here crying like a pathetic child instead of signing the paperwork Todd had explicitly prepared for me. I played my role perfectly, letting my voice tremble and my eyes fill with genuine tears. I held up the fabricated confession document and told her that Todd was trying to frame me for grand larceny. I whispered frantically that the corporate auditors were upstairs tearing the regional ledgers apart, and if I put my signature on this paper, I would be going to federal prison. I begged my own mother to protect me. I pleaded with her to tell Todd to stop this absolute madness and just give the money back. Susan let out a harsh, cruel scoff that echoed against the marble pillar. She physically slapped her hand over my mouth, silencing my desperate pleas. She told me to lower my voice and stop acting like a dramatic, hysterical burden. She said Todd had already transferred the funds to the Florida holding company, and there was absolutely no going back. I pulled her heavy hand away from my face, forcing myself to maintain eye contact with the woman who had given birth to me. I asked her point blank if she understood that the money Todd gave her was stolen directly from the Vanguard corporate accounts. I needed her to explicitly acknowledge the crime on the hidden digital audio recorder tucked securely beneath my collar. I asked her if she knew he had embezzled millions of dollars and was using my name to hide his criminal tracks. My mother did not even blink. She did not show a single ounce of surprise, remorse, or shame. She crossed her arms, looking at me with pure, unadulterated contempt. She flatly admitted that she knew exactly where the cash came from, and she absolutely did not care. She stated that corporate executives stole from their wealthy companies all the time, and Todd was simply smart enough to secure a better life for Ashley. She justified the massive theft by claiming my sister deserved to live in a luxury beachfront mansion. She told me the stolen funds were already paying for custom pool tiles and Italian marble floors, and no one was going to ruin her perfect daughter's dream home. The casualness with which she admitted to knowing about the fraud was deeply horrifying. She was actively protecting a criminal enterprise simply because it funded her vacation fantasies. I stood there staring at the woman I had spent 29 years desperately trying to please, fully realizing she viewed my freedom as nothing more than convenient currency. I asked her how she could let me take the fall. I asked how she could sleep knowing her youngest daughter was in a jail cell for a crime she did not commit. Susan stepped forward, backing me entirely into the cold, hard wall. Her eyes were completely devoid of any maternal warmth or human empathy. She looked at me not as a child she loved, but as a tool she owned. She delivered the final, devastating blow with absolute icy conviction. "You were always meant to serve your sister," she whispered venomously. "Sign the paper, Sarah." I pulled myself away from the cold marble pillar, leaving my mother standing there with her toxic demands hanging in the air between us. The heavy weight of the hidden audio recorder beneath my blouse felt like a physical shield pressing against my skin. It was exactly 1:00 in the afternoon, and the main lobby of Vanguard Financial had descended into a state of highly choreographed panic. The surprise arrival of the New York audit team had sent massive shockwaves through the entire building. Polished corporate executives were practically sprinting across the gleaming floors, carrying stacks of thick manila folders and encrypted tablets. The ambient noise was a chaotic symphony of ringing desk phones, hushed urgent whispers, and the rapid clicking of expensive leather shoes pacing back and forth across the tile. Everyone was desperately trying to project an aura of complete control, while their regional financial empire was being quietly dissected upstairs. I smoothed the wrinkles out of my skirt and took a deep breath, trying to steady my own racing pulse. I needed to get back to my desk to secure the cloned digital files before anyone noticed I was missing. As I navigated through the sea of tailored suits and frantic middle managers, something completely out of place caught my eye near the towering glass entrance doors. An elderly man had just wandered into the bustling corporate sanctuary. In a building filled with charcoal gray wool and crisp white collars, he stood out like a fragile, wandering ghost. He was wearing a faded, heavily pilled burgundy sweater and a pair of worn denim jeans that looked at least 10 years out of style. His white hair was thin and unkempt, and his shoulders hunched forward as if he were carrying an invisible, crushing weight. He looked profoundly lost and deeply overwhelmed by the towering architecture around him. I stopped walking, watching as he approached the curved mahogany reception desk. The main receptionist, a notoriously snobby woman named Jessica, who usually spent her afternoons browsing online luxury boutiques, was currently fielding 3 phone lines at once. The elderly man leaned against the high counter, his weathered face etched with deep confusion and mounting distress. He was not speaking at all. Instead, his trembling hands were moving rapidly through the air, gesturing and signing in a desperate attempt to communicate. He was frantically trying to get Jessica's attention, his fingers forming urgent shapes pointing toward the executive elevators and then back to his own chest. Jessica completely ignored him. She held a manicured finger up in a universal gesture of annoyance, keeping her eyes glued to her computer monitor while she continued her hushed phone conversation. The man let out a soft, frustrated sound, a terrible, raspy breath, and his hand movements became even more erratic and pleading. Before I could step forward to intervene, the heavy oak doors of the ground floor conference room swung open with a violent thud. Todd marched out into the lobby, trailed by 2 junior accountants who looked absolutely terrified. His face was flushed an angry, blotchy red, and he was wiping thick sweat from his forehead with a cloth handkerchief. The extreme pressure of the early audit was clearly fracturing his carefully maintained corporate mask. He barked a series of rapid-fire instructions to the junior staff, waving his hands dismissively to send them away. As he turned toward the elevator bank, his eyes locked onto the elderly man at the reception desk. Todd's expression instantly morphed from stressed panic to absolute, unadulterated disgust. He did not see a vulnerable human being in need of basic assistance. He only saw a dirty smudge on his perfect corporate canvas. He marched aggressively toward the front desk, bypassing a line of waiting clients. He did not bother to ask the man if he needed help or if he was looking for someone specific. He simply turned to the towering security guard stationed near the metal detectors and snapped his fingers loudly like he was calling a disobedient dog. He ordered the guard to handle the situation immediately. His voice echoed loudly across the suddenly quiet lobby, dripping with venomous arrogance. He told the guard to throw the vagrant out on the street before the board of directors came downstairs. He claimed the man was a loitering nuisance and an absolute embarrassment to the pristine company image. The security guard hesitated for a brief second, looking uncomfortably at the frail old man whose hands were still signing desperately in the air. But nobody in this building ever questioned Todd. The guard took a heavy step forward, reaching out to grab the old man's faded sweater. The elderly man shrank back, his eyes wide with genuine terror, letting out a small, panicked whimper that absolutely shattered my heart. I took a step forward, the sheer injustice of the entire situation burning hot in my veins. But before I could reach the reception desk, Todd spotted me standing near the marble pillar. He abandoned the cruel scene at the front entrance and stormed directly over to me, grabbing my elbow with a harsh, bruising grip. He pulled me close, his expensive cologne mixing with the sour stench of his nervous sweat. He completely ignored the horrific situation he had just instigated. Instead, he treated me exactly the way he had treated that poor, defenseless man, like a worthless piece of garbage taking up his valuable space. He shoved a crumpled $20 bill into my palm and ordered me to run across the street to the luxury cafe. He told me the senior executives from New York were demanding artisan coffee, and he needed me to go fetch it immediately. He hissed that I needed to make myself useful for once in my pathetic life and stop standing around staring blindly into space. He explicitly commanded me to deliver the drinks to the top-floor boardroom in exactly 15 minutes, or he would personally ensure I was fired before the end of the day. Todd did not wait for my response. He turned on his heel and strode toward the private executive elevator, adjusting his designer tie and pasting a fake, confident smile back onto his face. I stood there holding the crumpled money, my knuckles white with suppressed rage. I looked over at the reception desk. The security guard was currently gripping the elderly man's thin arm, forcefully ushering him toward the heavy glass exit doors. The man was dragging his feet, looking back toward the elevator banks with an expression of utterly profound heartbreak. His trembling fingers were still trying to sign, still desperately begging for someone in this cold, sterile building to simply stop and listen to him. My brother-in-law wanted me to run out and fetch expensive coffee to appease a group of wealthy corporate auditors. My mother wanted me to march to the slaughterhouse and sign away my freedom to finance her luxury beachfront mansion. They had both spent my entire life trying to convince me that I was nothing more than an obedient, invisible stepping stone for their endless ambitions. But as I watched that fragile, terrified man being shoved out into the unforgiving city street, the final remnants of my blind compliance shattered completely. I dropped the crumpled $20 bill onto the polished marble floor, leaving it behind. I was not going to get the coffee. I turned my back on the executive elevators and walked straight out the front doors, determined to find the old man before he disappeared into the crowded downtown sidewalks. I left the crumpled $20 bill lying on the cold marble floor. That piece of paper represented a lifetime of submission, and I was finally walking away. The towering security guard was actively steering the frail elderly man toward the revolving glass doors. The old man was resisting, planting his worn sneakers firmly onto the slick tile and waving his hands in a frantic, desperate rhythm. I moved quickly, crossing the vast lobby before my courage could evaporate. I stepped directly into the path of the guard, raising hands to signal him to stop. The guard looked down at me, completely bewildered. He knew me only as the quiet administrative coordinator who never caused any trouble. I told him in a calm, steady tone to let the gentleman go. The guard hesitated, loosening his aggressive grip just enough for the elderly man to pull his thin arm away. The man stumbled backward, rubbing his wrinkled sleeve and breathing heavily. He looked up at me with wide, terrified eyes, fully expecting me to be another corporate drone ready to toss him out onto the street. I did not reach for his arm or point toward the exit. Instead, I lifted my hands to chest level and carefully formed the gestures I had spent years practicing. During my early 20s, while Todd and my sister Ashley were networking at expensive country clubs sipping champagne, I had spent my weekends volunteering at a local community center. I taught basic financial literacy to deaf youth and adults who were frequently marginalized by the banking system. It was the one place in my entire life where I felt genuinely useful without being manipulated. I looked directly into the old man's frightened eyes and signed a simple, clear greeting. I asked him, my hands moving with fluid precision, if he was okay and how I could help him today. The transformation in the elderly man was immediate and profound. His hunched shoulders dropped an inch, and the deep lines of panic etched into his weathered face instantly softened into pure relief. He let out a long, shaky breath that sounded like years of pent-up frustration leaving his body. Someone in this sterile, hostile building finally understood him. He raised his own trembling hands and began to sign back to me. His movements were rapid but remarkably precise, carrying a quiet authority that completely contradicted his faded burgundy sweater and worn denim jeans. He signed that his name was Arthur, and he was incredibly frustrated by the terrible, disrespectful treatment he had received from the front desk staff. I signed back, apologizing sincerely for the harsh behavior of the receptionist and the security guard. I asked him again slowly and clearly who he was trying to find in the building. Arthur adjusted his posture, standing a little taller despite his fragile frame. He signed that he was not looking for one specific person. He explicitly formed the gestures, indicating he was actively searching for the main executive boardroom. He explained through his hands that he had a highly important meeting scheduled with the senior audit team from New York. He signed that he was here to personally check on a rather substantial corporate investment. I stared at him, my mind racing to process this monumental piece of new information. This unassuming man, who looked like a wandering vagrant to my arrogant brother-in-law, was claiming to have official business with the highest-level executives in our company. In the financial sector, true wealth rarely shouts or demands attention. It often whispers, hiding behind modest clothes and unassuming appearances. If Arthur was actually a major corporate investor arriving on the very day of a massive surprise internal audit, his presence here was absolutely no coincidence. Before I could ask Arthur any questions, a sharp, furious sound sliced through the ambient noise of the busy lobby. I turned my head and saw Todd. He had not taken the private elevator up to the executive suite yet. He had paused near the security turnstiles, waiting to watch me scurry across the street like an obedient dog to fetch his coffee. Instead, he saw me standing squarely in the middle of the main floor, actively conversing with the exact person he had just ordered to be thrown out like garbage. The task he had demanded was completely ignored. The expression on Todd's face shifted rapidly from baseline corporate panic to absolute explosive rage. His perfectly styled hair seemed to bristle, and his face turned an ugly, violent shade of crimson. He simply could not comprehend my sudden, blatant defiance. I was the family scapegoat. I was the pathetic sister-in-law who always nodded, always smiled, and always cleaned up his miserable messes without a single word of complaint. And right now, I was openly ignoring a direct authoritative order in front of the entire ground floor staff. He stormed away from the turnstiles, marching across the lobby with heavy, thudding footsteps. He ignored the shocked stares of passing clients and junior analysts. His hands were balled into tight, white-knuckled fists at his sides. He closed the distance between us, looking like he wanted to physically tear me apart right there in the lobby. He was shouting my name loudly, his voice echoing against the high marble ceiling, demanding to know what exactly I thought I was doing with this vagrant. I stood my ground, placing myself firmly between the furious regional manager and the elderly investor. I did not shrink away or lower my eyes. But just as Todd closed the final few feet, ready to unleash a barrage of vicious verbal abuse, the heavy, polished steel doors of the main executive elevator bank slid open with a loud, distinct chime. A group of stern-looking men and women in immaculate charcoal suits began to file out into the lobby. The senior corporate audit team had arrived downstairs, stepping directly into the path of Todd's unhinged, screaming rampage. The heavy, polished steel doors of the main executive elevator bank slid open with a loud, distinct chime. A group of stern-looking men and women in immaculate charcoal suits began to file out into the lobby. This was the senior corporate audit team from New York. They stepped directly into the path of my brother-in-law's unhinged, screaming rampage. I fully expected Todd to instantly freeze. I thought he would drop his hand from my elbow plaster on his signature fake corporate smile and immediately pivot to playing the gracious regional manager welcoming his esteemed guests. Any rational human being would have recognized the immense danger of the situation and de-escalated immediately. But Todd was no longer rational. He was backed into a corner by his own massive web of financial lies, and his towering arrogance had completely blinded him to reality. Instead of letting me go, his fingers dug even deeper into the soft fabric of my blouse, pinching the skin of my upper arm. His breathing was heavy and ragged. He looked at the senior auditors and then looked back at me. A dark, twisted calculation flashed across his bloodshot eyes. In that split second, he decided to lean into the chaos. He realized that a public spectacle might actually serve his incredibly malicious purpose. If he humiliated me in front of the entire corporate team, he could solidify the false narrative he had drafted in that urgent email. He could paint me as the erratic, insubordinate administrative coordinator right here in the main lobby, establishing his own innocence through sheer aggressive volume. He yanked me forcefully, pulling me a few inches away from Arthur. The elderly man stumbled back, his hands dropping to his sides in shock. Todd raised his voice, projecting his words so they bounced sharply off the high marble walls of the Vanguard Financial lobby. Every single conversation in the massive room died instantly. Phones stopped ringing. Junior analysts froze in their tracks. The senior executives from New York paused their advance, watching the scene unfold with varying expressions of confusion and mounting alarm. Todd completely unleashed his venom. He screamed that he had given me every possible chance to succeed in this company. He announced to the dead silent room that he had hired me out of the goodness of his heart because I was pathetic and unemployed, and begged my sister for a handout. He called me utterly useless. He called me a catastrophic failure who could not even follow basic instructions like fetching a simple cup of coffee without causing a massive disruption. The words hit the air like physical slaps, but I did not flinch. I stood perfectly still, letting the hidden digital recorder beneath my collar capture every single syllable of his toxic tirade. The lead auditor, a tall, imposing woman with sharp silver hair, stepped forward from the group of executives. She held up a hand, signaling for calm, but Todd was entirely beyond reach. He was drunk on his own desperate adrenaline. He pointed a trembling finger right at my face, spit flying from his lips as he escalated his performance to its final terrifying stage. He declared loudly that his patience had officially run out. He shouted that he had spent the entire morning uncovering massive, unforgivable routing anomalies in the regional budget. He claimed he had caught me red-handed manipulating the digital ledgers to cover up my gross financial negligence. He was practically panting now, putting on the performance of a lifetime for the New York team. He wanted them to believe he was the vigilant, dedicated manager fiercely protecting the company assets from a rogue employee. Then he delivered the ultimate blow, aiming to destroy my entire professional life in one swift motion. He screamed that I was officially fired. He terminated my employment right there in the center of the lobby in front of dozens of my coworkers and the highest-ranking members of the corporation. His voice boomed with terrifying authority, stating that he would be personally handing my fraudulent accounting files directly to the audit committee today. He promised to ensure I faced the absolute maximum legal consequences for what I had done to Vanguard Financial. I felt a cold shiver trace its way down my spine, but it was not from fear. It was the chilling realization of just how perfectly he had planned to ruin me. He was executing the exact strategy my mother and sister had demanded. He was sacrificing my freedom to protect their beachfront mansion and their luxury lifestyle. Todd did not stop there. His cruel gaze swept away from me and landed with absolute disgust on Arthur, who was still standing quietly nearby, watching the scene with wide, intelligent eyes. Todd spun toward the towering security guard who was standing awkwardly near the metal detectors, unsure of how to intervene in a high-level managerial dispute. Todd snapped his fingers violently, a gesture of supreme disrespect. He ordered the guard to step forward and do his damn job. He commanded the security team to immediately escort me off the corporate premises. He stated that my keycard access was permanently revoked and I was no longer permitted to step foot inside the building. Then he pointed a harsh, rigid finger directly at Arthur. He grouped us together in his mind as nothing more than disposable trash polluting his perfect kingdom. He loudly ordered the guard to throw this deaf beggar out onto the street along with me. He told them to clear the lobby of all the useless garbage before the board of directors were forced to witness any more of this pathetic display. The silence that followed his command was absolute and deafening. The security guard took a slow, hesitant step forward, reaching toward his utility belt. The junior analysts held their breath. The New York executives stood frozen, taking in the shocking scene. I looked at Arthur, fully expecting the fragile old man to finally break down and retreat. I expected him to turn around and flee from the overwhelming hostility. But Arthur did not move a single muscle toward the glass exit doors. He simply straightened his posture, the slight hunch in his shoulders disappearing completely. He reached into the inner pocket of his faded burgundy sweater, pulling out a pair of wire-rimmed glasses and a solid gold pen. The power dynamic in the room was about to shift with the force of a massive earthquake. The intense heat radiating from Todd's hand gripping my elbow was meant to entirely paralyze me. For my entire life, that specific brand of physical intimidation would have made me shrink into myself and apologize for simply taking up space. I would have dropped my head and scurried away to fetch his artisan coffee just to avoid a public scene. But the woman standing in the Vanguard Financial lobby today was not the obedient little scapegoat my family had relentlessly conditioned her to be. I looked down at his perfectly manicured fingers digging into the fabric of my blouse. The profound silence in the towering marble lobby amplified the sound of his ragged, panicked breathing. The senior audit team from New York stood completely motionless just a few yards away, watching the regional manager lose his absolute mind. I did not flinch. I did not shed a single tear or offer a desperate excuse. I simply reached over and wrapped my hand around his thick wrist. I squeezed his arm with a cold, steady pressure that clearly shocked him, and I slowly, physically removed his hand from my body. Todd stared at me with wide, bloodshot eyes, entirely unable to process the calm defiance radiating from my posture. His jaw worked silently as he struggled to comprehend why his favorite punching bag was refusing to break. I squared my shoulders and looked him dead in the eyes. I raised my voice, ensuring that every single syllable bounced clearly off the polished stone walls and reached the ears of the senior executive standing behind him. I told him in a remarkably steady tone that he did not have the authority to fire me for simply assisting a lost guest in the corporate lobby. I watched the color begin to drain from his flushed face as my words hung heavily in the dead quiet air. Then I delivered the fatal blow. I projected my voice even louder, making absolutely certain the lead auditor with the sharp silver hair heard my next sentence. I stated that he certainly did not have the authority to fire me in order to frame me for his $2.5 million offshore theft. The words hit the crowded room like a massive physical shockwave. A collective gasp rippled through the junior analysts and the reception staff. The New York audit team instantly stiffened their posture, shifting from confused bystanders to highly alert corporate investigators. The lead auditor narrowed her eyes, staring directly at Todd with a sudden, intense scrutiny. For a fraction of a second, Todd looked like he had been physically struck by lightning. His mouth opened and closed like a suffocating fish. He glanced frantically over his shoulder at the wall of gray suits observing him. He was cornered, and his inflated ego immediately triggered a complete and utter meltdown. He threw his head back and let out a loud, manic laugh that sounded entirely unhinged. It was a harsh, grating sound that echoed terribly in the open space. He clapped his hands together, rubbing them in a frantic, sweaty rhythm. He turned toward the senior audit team, plastering a desperately fake smile across his flushed face. He spread his arms wide, treating the executives like an audience he desperately needed to win over. He loudly announced that I was completely out of my mind. He claimed I was having a severe mental breakdown right there in the lobby. He yelled that I was a bitter, disgruntled administrative assistant who had just been caught trying to manipulate the regional ledgers. He spun his fabricated narrative with terrifying speed, desperately trying to paint me as a hysterical liar who was making up insane accusations to save my own skin. He pointed a trembling finger at me, telling the auditors that my wild claims of a multi-million-dollar theft were nothing but the desperate delusions of a failing employee. He was sweating profusely now, his expensive silk tie visibly stained with nervous perspiration. He turned his manic energy back toward the towering security guard who was still standing awkwardly near the front entrance. Todd completely abandoned his corporate composure and began screaming at the top of his lungs. He demanded that the guard arrest me immediately. He shouted that I was a corporate saboteur and a dangerous thief who needed to be escorted out of the building in handcuffs. He ordered the front desk to lock down the entire network and call the police. The security guard took a hesitant step forward, clearly overwhelmed by the sheer magnitude of the situation. The entire lobby felt like a powder keg waiting for a single spark to ignite. Todd was pacing back and forth, running his hands through his perfectly styled hair, shooting venomous, triumphant glares in my direction. He truly believed his loud, aggressive performance was enough to override my devastating accusation. He thought that if he just screamed loud enough, the corporate executives would instinctively side with the regional director over a low-level coordinator. He was banking on the old, familiar family dynamic where his loud demands always crushed my quiet truth. I did not back down. I stood my ground near the marble pillar, feeling the comforting weight of the digital audio recorder hidden beneath my collar. I knew I had the ultimate proof waiting in my pocket. I just needed to maintain my composure while he completely destroyed his own professional credibility. But before the confused security guard could reach me, the dynamic in the room fundamentally shifted. The fragile, elderly man in the faded burgundy sweater had been standing silently near the glass doors, watching the entire chaotic spectacle unfold. Todd had completely dismissed him as a worthless vagrant moments ago. But the deaf gentleman did not look lost or confused anymore. He stepped forward, walking directly past the hesitant security guard with a slow, purposeful stride that commanded absolute attention. The manic shouting instantly died down as everyone turned to watch the old man approach the center of the lobby. He stopped right beside me, turning his weathered face toward Todd and the stunned audit executives. With a fluid, deliberate motion, the elderly man reached a trembling hand beneath the collar of his worn sweater. He grabbed a silver-beaded chain and pulled it upward, revealing a heavy, solid brass identification badge that caught the harsh overhead lights. The heavy, solid brass badge caught the bright fluorescent lights of the lobby, reflecting a blinding gleam across the polished marble walls. The entire room seemed to hold its collective breath as the small piece of metal settled against the faded fabric of the old man's burgundy sweater. I stepped slightly closer, my eyes focusing on the deeply engraved black lettering. The name pressed into the brass read, Harrison Sterling. Directly beneath it, in unmistakable bold print, were the words, Founder and Chief Executive Officer. The atmospheric shift in the Vanguard financial lobby was instantaneous and absolutely staggering. The wall of senior corporate auditors from New York who had just stepped off the elevator completely dropped their stern, investigative postures. They immediately straightened their shoulders and lowered their heads in a synchronized display of profound reverence. The man standing next to me was not a wandering vagrant or a lost beggar looking for a handout. He was the architect of the entire corporate empire. He owned the walls we were standing within, the floor beneath our feet, and the very paychecks my brother-in-law so desperately craved. I turned my gaze slowly toward Todd. Watching the arrogant regional manager process his colossal, catastrophic mistake was like watching a freight train derail in agonizing slow motion. The angry, flushed red color completely drained from his face, leaving behind a sickly, translucent gray. The vein that had been bulging furiously in his neck suddenly went flat. His mouth hung slightly open, his jaw slack with pure, unadulterated terror. He tried to take a step backward, but his expensive leather shoes seemed permanently glued to the polished tile. His knees visibly trembled beneath his tailored trousers. He had just ordered security to physically throw his ultimate boss onto the unforgiving city streets. He had called the founder of his company disposable garbage in front of the entire corporate board. The towering security guard, who had been mere seconds away from grabbing Harrison's arm, let out a soft, horrified gasp and practically leaped backward. He retreated toward the metal detectors, staring intensely at the floor, hoping to completely vanish into the background before anyone noticed his involvement. The junior analysts, who had been scurrying around like frightened mice, stood completely frozen, dropping their thick binders and encrypted tablets to their sides. Harrison Sterling did not look frail or confused anymore. The subtle hunch in his shoulders evaporated entirely, replacing his vulnerable facade with a towering, commanding presence. He looked at Todd with eyes as cold and unforgiving as a frozen ocean. Without a single trace of hesitation, his hands began to move. His gestures were no longer desperate or frantic. They were sharp, precise, and fiercely authoritative. He was not asking for directions anymore. He was delivering a corporate execution. From the rigid line of New York executives, a woman with a sleek black briefcase stepped forward. She moved with quiet efficiency, positioning herself just a half step behind Harrison's right shoulder. She was his personal interpreter, embedded within the audit team, seamlessly blending in until this exact moment. She watched Harrison's hands with intense concentration, and then she translated his gestures for the dead silent lobby. Her voice was crystal clear, echoing with the immense power of the man standing beside me. Mr. Sterling says that every single brick in this building belongs to him, she announced, her tone completely devoid of any sympathy. He says he came down here today completely undercover because he was personally tipped off about massive financial irregularities in your specific region, Todd. Todd let out a pathetic whimpering sound, shaking his head weakly as if trying to deny the reality crashing down around him. He raised a trembling hand as though he could physically push the interpreter's words away, but the woman did not stop. Harrison continued to sign, his movements relentless and absolute, slicing through the thick, suffocating tension in the room. Mr. Sterling wishes to clarify that he intentionally wore these clothes and approached your desk without his usual security detail, she translated flawlessly. He received troubling reports about your aggressive leadership style and the deeply toxic culture you cultivate on this floor. He wanted to see exactly how the regional manager treats vulnerable people when he truly believes no one important is watching. The sheer magnitude of the trap snapped completely shut around Todd. He was completely exposed. There was no corporate jargon or slick manipulation that could possibly save him now. The founder of the company had personally witnessed his absolute cruelty, his blatant disrespect, and his willingness to physically assault a deaf elderly man simply for existing in his line of sight. And more importantly, Harrison had just confirmed that the New York team was already investigating the very financial irregularities Todd was currently trying to frame me for. I stood incredibly still, feeling the cool plastic of the digital audio recorder resting against my collarbone. A profound wave of absolute victory washed over my entire body. Todd had spent my entire adult life making me feel small, stupid, and entirely dependent on his toxic generosity. My own mother had demanded I sacrifice my future to protect his criminal offshore accounts and my sister's luxury lifestyle. They both genuinely believed they could toss me to the wolves and walk away completely unscathed. They viewed my empathy and quiet nature as a fatal weakness. But Todd had just destroyed his own kingdom through his blinding arrogance while my empathy had just saved me. Harrison finished signing and lowered his hands to his sides. He turned his head slowly away from the trembling regional manager and looked directly at me. The harsh coldness in his eyes melted away instantly. He offered me a small, warm smile filled with genuine gratitude and profound respect. I had been the only person in this massive, sterile building willing to treat him like a human being. I had broken ranks, defied a direct order from a tyrant, and used my own quiet skills to offer him basic human dignity. Todd sank heavily against the receptionist's desk, his legs finally giving out completely. He clutched the edge of the mahogany counter, gasping for air as the corporate executives closed in around him like sharks smelling blood in the water. His multi-million-dollar theft, his cruel family extortion, and his arrogant reign of terror were entirely over. The air in the lobby was so heavy you could practically cut it with a knife. The stunning revelation of Harrison Sterling had completely paralyzed the entire room. Every single executive and junior staff member remained glued to the marble floor. The woman with the sleek black briefcase stood perfectly composed, her sharp eyes fixed entirely on my trembling brother-in-law. She raised her hand gracefully, directing the attention of the entire room back to the center of the conflict. She pointed a manicured finger directly at Todd's chest. "Mr. Sterling wishes me to inform you that you failed his test, Todd," she announced, her voice ringing like a crystal bell in a silent cathedral. "You failed it absolutely miserably." Todd looked as though all the blood had been aggressively siphoned from his veins. He stood there, clutching the edge of the curved reception desk, gasping for oxygen like a stranded fish. He had built his entire career on stepping on the necks of those he considered beneath him. Now the brilliant architect of the very company he had been actively robbing had watched him do it in broad daylight. Harrison did not waste another second looking at the pathetic regional manager. He turned his weathered face back to me. The harsh, icy authority that had just dismantled my brother-in-law completely vanished. His eyes were warm and intensely perceptive. He lifted his hands again, moving his fingers with that same fluid grace. I watched closely, my own hands instinctively twitching as I translated his silent words in my mind. He signed that he knew exactly who I was. He explained through his swift hand gestures that he had been quietly investigating the Vanguard regional office for weeks, trying to track the massive offshore financial bleeding. He signed that he knew I was the diligent administrative coordinator who had been logging the strange transfer discrepancies long before Todd tried to cover them up with his lies. He asked me gently but firmly if I had the concrete proof he needed to finish this investigation today. My heart gave a powerful leap against my ribs. I had spent years being entirely invisible, being the convenient scapegoat for my cruel family and the silent worker bee at this firm. But this man, this billionaire founder, had actually seen me. He had noticed my quiet late-night audits and my meticulous attention to detail. I reached deep into the pocket of my skirt, and my fingers wrapped tightly around the small metal object I had carefully guarded for weeks. I pulled out the encrypted silver flash drive. It was tiny and unassuming, and yet it held the undeniable, devastating blueprint of Todd's $2.5 million offshore embezzlement scheme. I had meticulously compiled every single unauthorized wire transfer, every fake vendor invoice, and every deleted email thread into a single, undeniable master folder. I called it the shadow file. I stepped forward, bypassing the groveling regional manager, and held the flash drive out toward Harrison. I looked directly at the lead corporate auditor, the imposing woman with the sharp silver hair standing right beside him. I told her in a strong, unwavering voice that every single piece of evidence she needed to bury him was on this drive. I stated clearly that it contained the complete transaction history linking the stolen corporate funds directly to a hidden shell company owned entirely by my mother and my brother-in-law. The lead auditor did not hesitate for a fraction of a second. She reached out and took the small metal drive from my palm. Her expression was a mask of pure professional determination and righteous authority. She pulled a high-tech encrypted tablet from her leather portfolio and powered the bright screen on right there in the middle of the crowded lobby. The quiet, distinct click of the flash drive sliding into the tablet port sounded like a heavy steel deadbolt locking on a prison cell. That tiny mechanical noise was the exact moment Todd realized his elaborate house of cards had completely collapsed into dust. The fabricated performance plan he had tried to force me to sign was completely useless. The endless lies he had fed my mother, the coordinated family extortion, the luxury real estate purchases, all of it was about to be laid completely bare on that glowing high-resolution screen. Pure desperate animal panic finally overrode his corporate paralysis. Todd let out a ragged, terrifying sound and suddenly pushed violently away from the reception desk. He abandoned his tailored jacket and his expensive leather briefcase, letting them drop to the floor. He bolted like a cornered rat. He shoved a bewildered junior analyst out of the way and made a frantic, mad dash toward the towering glass revolving doors leading out to the safety of the busy city street. But the absolute power dynamic in the building had officially shifted. The towering security guard who had been prepared to throw Harrison out just a few minutes earlier now understood exactly who signed his paychecks and who held the real authority. He took a single decisive step forward, moving with astonishing speed and agility for his massive size. He planted his broad frame directly in front of the glass exit doors, crossing his thick, muscular arms over his chest. He completely blocked the only path to freedom, looking down at the panicked regional manager with a grim, unyielding expression. Todd slammed hard into the guard and bounced off, stumbling backward onto the cold marble floor. He landed in a pathetic heap, completely trapped inside the very building he had tried to rule with an iron fist. The executives simply watched him fall, their faces devoid of any pity. The trap was permanently sealed and justice was finally arriving. The quiet hum of the encrypted tablet processing my flash drive seemed louder than a jet engine in the vast frozen lobby of Vanguard Financial. Todd was still scrambling backward on the polished marble floor like a terrified crab, trying to put distance between himself and the towering security guard. Nobody offered him a hand to help him up. The executives simply stared down at him with expressions of absolute contempt. The woman with the sharp silver hair, the lead corporate auditor, tapped the glass screen of her tablet. Her eyes rapidly scanned the initial summary document I had meticulously compiled over the last 3 weeks. She did not even bother to look at the groveling regional manager as she began to speak. She read the contents of my shadow file out loud, letting her crisp, authoritative voice project across the sprawling room. Every single word was a fatal strike against the fraudulent empire my brother-in-law had built. She started with the raw numbers detailing a highly systematic bleeding of regional corporate assets. She read off the exact routing codes of the offshore accounts, tracing the stolen money across international borders with undeniable clarity. The junior analyst standing near the reception desk gasped audibly as she listed the massive dollar amounts. It was $2.5 million systematically drained from the company operating budget over the span of a single year. The lead auditor swiped her finger across the tablet screen, pulling up the next section of my compiled evidence. She announced that a shell corporation had been established exactly 14 months ago in a jurisdiction known for protecting hidden assets. She took a slow, deliberate breath before reading the name of the primary beneficiary listed on the limited liability company documents. It was Ashley, my own sister. The golden child who had spent her entire life demanding perfection and luxury was legally tethered to a massive federal crime. My mother and my sister had actively conspired to funnel stolen corporate funds into their private accounts to finance their sprawling beachfront mansion and their designer wardrobes. Then the auditor reached the most damning section of the file. She read aloud the precise timestamps from the internal server logs. These were the hidden digital footprints I had discovered during my late-night audits. She stated clearly that the logs showed exactly when Todd had accessed the secure system using his own executive administrative credentials. She read out the exact minutes and seconds, proving that he had bypassed the dual authentication protocols late at night when the office was completely empty. The evidence definitively showed him manually attempting to copy and paste my digital signature onto the fraudulent wire transfers. He had actively tried to frame me, leaving a perfectly preserved trail of digital breadcrumbs leading right back to his own computer terminal. Todd realized in that exact moment that the trap was completely inescapable. The physical proof was staring him right in the face, held by the highest-ranking financial investigator in the corporation. He scrambled onto his knees, clutching his hands together in a pathetic, trembling prayer. He looked up at Harrison Sterling and the imposing wall of New York executives, and he did exactly what cowards always do when they are finally cornered by the truth. He turned on his own accomplices like a rabid dog. He did not apologize for stealing the money. He did not show an ounce of remorse for trying to send me, an innocent woman, to federal prison. Instead, he threw my sister and my mother directly under the bus. He screamed at the top of his lungs that the embezzlement was absolutely not his idea. He pointed his shaking fingers frantically in the air, crying out that he was a victim of manipulation. He yelled that his wife Ashley was a greedy monster who was completely obsessed with status and unearned luxury. He claimed she threatened to divorce him and take everything if he did not provide her with a multi-million-dollar lifestyle. He was weeping openly, now tears and sweat rolling down his red face as he dragged my mother into his desperate confession. He shouted that Susan, my own mother, had relentlessly pressured him to steal the company funds. He told the silent lobby that Susan had masterminded the offshore shell company and forced him to execute the transfers to pay for her extravagant vacation homes and her country club memberships. He wailed that they were terrible, wicked women who had completely ruined his life and forced him into a corner. He begged Harrison Sterling for mercy, pleading for a leniency deal in exchange for turning state evidence against his own family members. I stood incredibly still, watching the man who had terrorized me for years completely disintegrate into a puddle of miserable tears. He was practically crawling on the floor, begging the billionaire founder not to send him to jail. He offered to testify against his wife and his mother-in-law, promising to give the auditors every single detail of their lavish spending if it meant saving his own skin. It was the most pathetic display of human weakness I had ever witnessed in my entire 28 years of life. The profound irony of the situation settled deep into my bones. For my whole life, my mother and my sister had treated me like disposable garbage while treating Todd like a golden king, because he provided them with endless money. They had all agreed to sacrifice me to protect their perfect little criminal enterprise. But the moment the illusion shattered, there was no loyalty left among the thieves. Todd was eagerly selling them out to save himself, proving that their conditional love was just as hollow and fake as the corporate image he had tried to project. The sheer poetic justice of watching them destroy each other was more satisfying than I ever could have imagined. Harrison Sterling looked down at the weeping regional manager with an expression of absolute profound disgust. He did not offer a single word of comfort or mercy. He simply raised his hand and gestured toward the towering security guard, who was still blocking the main exit doors. The final reckoning had officially arrived, and there was absolutely nowhere left for Todd to hide. Harrison Sterling did not blink as Todd whimpered on the polished marble floor. The billionaire founder of Vanguard Financial possessed a quiet authority that required no shouting. He simply observed the crumbling regional manager with the detached clinical interest of a scientist examining a ruined specimen. Todd was still babbling his pathetic, desperate pleas, throwing his wife and my mother to the wolves in a frantic attempt to buy his own salvation. His expensive suit jacket was crumpled on the floor, his silk tie was skewed, and his face was slick with a miserable sheen of sweat. Harrison raised his hands. His movements were sharp, precise, and entirely final. He executed a single fluid gesture that sliced through the heavy, suffocating air of the corporate lobby. The sleek interpreter standing dutifully at his right shoulder did not hesitate. Her voice rang out crisp and devoid of any human warmth. "Call the police," she commanded. The words hung in this vast open space like a heavy iron gavel striking a wooden block. The towering security guard guarding the main exit immediately reached for the radio clipped to his utility belt. He pressed the dispatch button and relayed the urgent code to building security and local law enforcement. Todd let out a ragged, horrifying sound that was half sob and half scream. He curled his knees toward his chest, pressing his face into his hands, as the inescapable reality of his situation completely crushed him. There would be no secret corporate buyout. There would be no quiet resignation or severance package. He was going to leave this pristine building in handcuffs. The agonizing minutes that followed felt like wading through thick, wet cement. The main lobby remained suspended in a state of collective shock. Junior analysts and senior executives alike stood rooted to the floor, unable to look away from the spectacular destruction of a man who had made their daily lives absolutely miserable. Nobody offered him a glass of water. Nobody whispered a word of comfort. The sheer magnitude of his $2.5 million theft, combined with the shocking cruelty he had displayed toward an elderly man, had completely vaporized any lingering ounce of professional sympathy. I stood by the marble pillar, watching the man who had actively tried to send me to a federal prison writhe in his own self-inflicted misery. The heavy digital recorder was still hidden safely beneath my blouse, capturing the ragged sounds of his total defeat. I felt a profound, strange calmness settling over my bones. The terrifying anxiety that had ruled my entire life, the constant fear of stepping out of line and displeasing my toxic family, was completely gone. In the distance, the faint, distinct wail of police sirens began to echo through the busy downtown streets. The sound started as a high-pitched hum bleeding through the thick glass doors of the lobby, and steadily grew into a deafening, urgent roar. Todd heard it too. His head snapped up, his bloodshot eyes wide with fresh, blinding panic. He scrambled backward against the sleek reception desk, leaving wet handprints on the polished wood. Two uniformed city police officers burst through the revolving doors, their heavy boots thudding against the pristine floor. The lead corporate auditor met them instantly, handing over the glowing tablet that contained the undeniable digital blueprint of the shadow file. She spoke in low, rapid sentences outlining the wire fraud, the fake vendors, and the forged administrative timestamps. The officers did not need to hear another word. They marched directly toward the cowering regional manager. They grabbed him by his sweaty shoulders, hauling him roughly to his feet. Todd did not fight them. He had absolutely nothing left in his arsenal. The metallic clicking of the heavy steel handcuffs closing tightly around his wrists echoed sharply across the quiet room. One of the officers began reciting his legal rights in a bored, monotone voice, while the other firmly guided him toward the exit. The entire Vanguard financial staff watched in absolute silence as their former boss was paraded through the lobby like a common criminal. His head was bowed, his chin practically touching his chest. He did not look at the New York audit team. He did not look at the brilliant billionaire founder he had insulted. And he certainly did not look at me. The golden boy, the man my mother worshipped as the ultimate provider, was being shoved into the back of a flashing police cruiser in front of his entire professional world. The glass doors slid shut behind him, sealing his fate forever. With the toxic storm finally removed from the building, the heavy tension in the air immediately began to dissipate. Harrison Sterling turned his attention away from the exit doors and walked slowly toward me. The sea of charcoal suits automatically parted to let him through. He stopped just a few feet away, offering a warm, genuine smile that reached all the way to the corners of his bright, intelligent eyes. He extended his right hand. I took it firmly, feeling the quiet, solid strength in his grip. He released my hand and began to sign, his gestures smooth and incredibly respectful. The interpreter stepped forward, translating his words with a newfound gentle warmth. "Mr. Sterling says that you possess a rare and invaluable integrity," she said. "He watched you risk your own employment to protect a vulnerable stranger. He watched you stand your ground against a terrible bully. Vanguard Financial does not just need people who can read a spreadsheet. We desperately need leaders who refuse to compromise their moral compass." The interpreter paused, letting Harrison finish his final graceful sign. "Mr. Sterling says we currently have an unexpected vacancy. He would be deeply honored if you would accept the position of Regional Director of Finance." My breath caught sharply in my throat. I looked at the incredible man standing before me and then at the faces of the senior executives who were now nodding in quiet, unanimous agreement. I had spent my entire life being treated like a worthless, invisible stepping stone. Now the founder of a massive corporate empire was handing me the keys to the entire region. I squared my shoulders, looking directly into Harrison's eyes, and signed my acceptance with profound gratitude. But as the lobby erupted into genuine supportive applause, a cold, familiar reality settled into the back of my mind. Todd was sitting in a jail cell, but the money was still sitting in an offshore shell company. My cruel mother and my greedy sister were currently waiting at their sprawling beachfront mansion, completely oblivious to the massive inferno heading their way. I had just conquered my professional nightmare, but the ultimate battle was far from over. I still had to face the very women who had eagerly engineered my destruction. The drive to my mother's house took exactly 45 minutes, but it felt like traveling backward through a lifetime of carefully constructed trauma. The adrenaline from the lobby of Vanguard Financial had slowly faded away, leaving behind a profound, crystal-clear focus that I had never experienced before. The sun was just beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long, jagged shadows across the perfectly manicured lawns of my mother's upscale suburban neighborhood. For my entire life, pulling into this wide, circular driveway had triggered a deep, sickening knot of anxiety in my stomach. I had always arrived as the inadequate daughter, the massive disappointment, the ungrateful burden who needed to be fixed or hidden away from the neighbors. But tonight, the heavy wrought iron gates and the pristine rose bushes did not intimidate me. I parked my modest sedan directly behind my sister's absurdly expensive luxury sports utility vehicle. I turned off the ignition and sat in the quiet cabin for a long moment, letting the peaceful silence wash over me. Todd was currently sitting in a cold holding cell downtown, completely stripped of his tailored suit and his arrogant swagger. Now it was finally time to address the actual architects of my lifelong misery. I walked up the winding brick path and unlocked the heavy mahogany front door with the spare brass key I had kept on my ring for years. The moment I stepped into the grand vaulted foyer, the grand illusion of their perfect, wealthy life immediately shattered into a million pieces. The house was in a state of absolute, frantic, chaotic destruction. Designer luggage was splayed open across the expensive imported Persian rugs. Piles of silk blouses, thick cashmere sweaters, and velvet shoe bags were thrown carelessly over the pristine white living room furniture. The harsh, glaring lights of the crystal chandelier illuminated the pure, blind panic unfolding in the center of the room. My sister Ashley and my mother Susan were practically running in circles, throwing valuable items into the suitcases with frantic, uncoordinated movements. They had clearly received the catastrophic phone call about Todd's spectacular public arrest at the corporate office. The offshore shell company they had actively used to fund this ridiculous lifestyle was undoubtedly frozen by federal investigators, and they were preparing to flee the jurisdiction like common desperate criminals. I stood quietly in the wide archway, simply watching them tear their own beautiful house apart. Ashley was sobbing hysterically, her perfect, expensive makeup running in dark, muddy streaks down her flushed red cheeks. She was clutching a handful of heavy diamond jewelry boxes, hyperventilating loudly as she tried to force them into an already overflowing designer duffel bag. Then Susan looked up from a pile of paperwork and spotted me standing there in the doorway. The sheer terror in my mother's eyes vanished in an instant, replaced by a hot, vicious glare of pure, unadulterated hatred. She dropped a thick stack of designer scarves onto the hardwood floor and marched directly toward me with heavy, stomping steps. She did not ask how I was doing. She did not ask what had happened at the corporate office today. She immediately launched into a venomous, screaming tirade. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger mere inches from my face, demanding to know exactly what I had done to her precious son-in-law. Ashley dropped her leather luggage and rushed over to join the brutal verbal assault. My sister screamed at the top of her lungs that I had completely destroyed her entire family because I was a bitter, jealous loser who could not stand to see her happy and successful. They formed a tight wall of toxic rage, screaming over each other, blaming me entirely for the inevitable collapse of their illegal luxury empire. Susan demanded that I march directly down to the city precinct and fix my catastrophic mistake immediately. She explicitly ordered me to empty my personal savings account, cash out my modest retirement fund, and secure whatever high-interest loans I needed to pay for Todd's massive bail. She insisted that I owed them this massive financial sacrifice because I had selfishly ruined their perfect life by refusing to blindly sign the fraudulent performance plan. She claimed it was entirely my fault that the corporate auditors had discovered the offshore transfers, completely ignoring the undeniable fact that Todd was the one who had actively stolen $2.5 million. I stood perfectly still, letting their hysterical, selfish demands wash over me like a dying wave crashing against a solid stone breakwater. The loud shouting and the vicious, targeted insults that used to make me cower and apologize endlessly now sounded incredibly pathetic and hollow. I looked at the two grown women who had spent 28 years treating me like an emotional punching bag, and I felt absolutely nothing but cold, detached pity. I told them in a quiet, unwavering voice that I would not spend a single solitary penny to rescue a convicted corporate criminal. I clearly stated that Todd was going to a federal prison and their fraudulent offshore accounts were currently being seized by aggressive corporate investigators. I told them that the luxury mansion, the expensive cars, and the designer clothes were all bought with stolen corporate money, and they were going to lose absolutely everything they thought they owned. The harsh reality of my calm words hit Susan like a massive physical blow to the chest. Her face violently contorted into a terrifying mask of primal fury. The carefully maintained, delicate facade of the elegant suburban socialite completely melted away, revealing the cruel, abusive, raging bully hiding underneath. She let out a harsh, guttural scream and raised her right hand high into the air, pulling it back to deliver a punishing, stinging slap directly across my face. It was the exact same violent physical motion she had consistently used to terrorize me into silent submission since I was a very little girl. She fully expected me to flinch. She fully expected me to close my eyes, turn my head away, and accept the physical punishment for daring to speak the absolute truth. But I did not close my eyes. I did not shrink away into the shadows. With sharp reflexes born from years of suppressed survival instinct, my left hand shot upward with blinding speed. I caught my mother's swinging wrist firmly in midair. My fingers clamped down incredibly hard around her delicate bird, like bones stopping her moving hand mere inches from my cheek. The loud, cracking smack she had eagerly anticipated never happened. Instead, the grand living room fell into a sudden, horrifying, heavy silence. Susan's eyes went wide with absolute profound shock, staring blankly at my hand gripping her wrist like an unyielding steel vise. She tried to violently yank her arm away, but I held on tight, my grip firm and completely unshakable. I did not squeeze hard enough to break anything, but I squeezed hard enough to make sure she finally understood that the power dynamic in this broken family had permanently and violently shifted. I stared directly into her terrified, panicked eyes, my demeanor ice-cold and radiating absolute, unwavering authority. I was no longer the helpless, frightened child she could easily beat into blind compliance, and she was about to learn that painful lesson the incredibly hard way. I released my grip on her wrist with a sharp, definitive flick of my hand. Susan stumbled backward, rubbing her bone-thin arm with her other hand. Her eyes were wide with a frantic mix of deep confusion and absolute terror. The grand vaulted living room became so incredibly quiet, you could actually hear the heavy brass pendulum of the grandfather clock ticking methodically in the hallway. I did not raise my voice or scream the way she had just done. I did not need to scream because true power never has to announce itself loudly. I reached a steady hand into my dark leather tote bag and pulled out a thick, heavy stack of crisp white papers. These were not standard corporate memos or simple office printouts. They were official federal legal documents freshly printed and thoroughly certified by the authorities. I walked over to the absurdly expensive glass coffee table sitting in the center of the room and dropped the massive stack right on top of it. The heavy, solid thud echoed through the tense space, sounding exactly like a judge striking a wooden gavel to deliver a final, unforgiving verdict. Ashley cautiously approached the table, her tear-stained face twisting into a mask of pure, bewildered panic. She looked down at the bold black lettering printed across the very top page of the stack. I stood there and watched my sister's perfectly manicured finger trace the imposing official seal of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I told her in a perfectly calm tone that she might want to sit down and read the fine print very carefully before she continued packing her designer luggage. I explained that Todd did not just steal $2.5 million from Vanguard Financial. He needed a secure, untraceable place to hide that massive mountain of stolen wealth. And since he was already deeply embedded in a catastrophic web of corporate fraud, he decided to use the two most greedy, gullible people he knew to build his ultimate protective shield. I pointed firmly to the second page of the federal indictment detailing the offshore shell company. I told them the limited liability corporation was not registered under his name at all. It was registered entirely and exclusively under the names Ashley and Susan. My mother let out a sudden strangled gasp, clutching her chest as if all the oxygen had been violently sucked out of the room. She stammered out a weak, pathetic defense claiming she knew absolutely nothing about complex corporate structures or illegal offshore wire transfers. She insisted she was just an innocent mother trusting her incredibly successful son-in-law to manage the family finances. But I shook my head slowly, completely shattering her desperate fantasy right in front of her eyes. I told them all about the digital audio recorder my lawyer had provided to me earlier that week. I explained how it had been actively running beneath my blouse all morning, capturing every single horrific word they had spoken. I reminded Susan of our intense conversation behind the marble pillar in the corporate lobby just a few hours ago. I recited her exact cruel words back to her verbatim. I reminded her of the way she flatly admitted to knowing the money was completely stolen, the way she happily justified the massive corporate theft just to fund Ashley's luxury beachfront mansion. The chilling, unforgettable moment she ordered me to sign a fake confession and take the fall for a federal crime simply because I was born to serve my older sister. I told them those crystal-clear audio files were currently sitting on the desk of the lead corporate auditor and the local police department. Ashley completely collapsed onto the pristine white sofa, her trembling legs finally giving out beneath her. She started frantically tapping on the screen of her expensive cell phone, desperately trying to log into her mobile banking application. I watched the exact second the horrific reality of her situation registered on her face. A bright red error message blinked across her screen, denying her access to the funds she had stolen. I did not wait for her to ask what was wrong. I delivered the final, devastating blow with absolutely zero hesitation. I told her the federal bank investigators had officially frozen every single account tied to her name and her social security number. I explained that law enforcement had already seized the new beachfront property, the luxury vehicles, and the offshore accounts. They had absolutely nothing left in the world. Their entire glittering kingdom of stolen wealth was completely gone in an instant. And worse? I turned my gaze back to my mother, watching her physically shrink under the crushing weight of the absolute truth. I told Susan she was officially listed as a primary co-conspirator in a multi-million-dollar federal embezzlement scheme. The sheer staggering magnitude of their complete and utter destruction finally settled heavily over the silent room. The expensive designer clothes scattered across the hardwood floor no longer looked like symbols of high social status. They looked exactly like criminal evidence. Susan and Ashley were no longer arrogant, untouchable suburban socialites dictating the miserable terms of my daily existence. They were destitute criminal suspects facing decades in a federal penitentiary. All the cruel insults and violent physical demands they had hurled at me just moments ago vanished completely into thin air. They were utterly broken, entirely stripped of their stolen armor and their unearned pride. Then the most unimaginable thing happened right before my eyes. Susan, the woman who had spent my entire life making me feel incredibly small and fundamentally worthless, slowly dropped to her knees right there on the expensive Persian rug. Ashley immediately followed, collapsing onto the floor right beside her mother. The two women who had happily conspired to throw me into a dark prison cell were now looking up at me from the ground with heavy tears streaming down their completely ruined faces. They desperately clasped their trembling hands together, sobbing violently and begging for any shred of mercy they could find. They begged me to use my brand new relationship with Harrison Sterling to save them from ruin. They pleaded with me to use my new power as the regional director of finance to somehow sweep their federal crimes under the rug and keep them out of handcuffs. I stared down at the two women weeping on the expensive Persian rug. For 28 years, my mother Susan and my sister Ashley had towered over me. They had dictated every single aspect of my existence, demanding endless sacrifices to feed their insatiable hunger for luxury and social status. Now they were completely reduced to trembling figures clutching frantically at the hem of my simple skirt. Ashley was sobbing so hard her breath hitched in ragged, pathetic gasps, pleading with me to call Harrison Sterling and make the federal agents simply go away. Susan reached out with the very same hand she had tried to strike me with just moments earlier, desperately grasping for my forgiveness. She wept bitterly about blood being thicker than water. She cried about how families need to stick together during hard times. The sheer hypocrisy of her words hung in the stale air of that massive living room. When Todd was throwing me to the wolves to cover his criminal tracks, they had actively handed him the matches to burn my life to the ground. They had fully intended to watch me take the fall for a multi-million-dollar corporate fraud. They did not care about blood or family loyalty when I was the one facing absolute ruin. They only remembered we were related when the federal indictments landed squarely on their own laps. I felt a profound sense of detachment watching them unravel. The deep, agonizing ache of wanting their love, the desperate childhood need for my mother's approval simply vanished. It was entirely replaced by a quiet, immense clarity. I slowly took a step back, forcing Susan to release her desperate grip on my clothes. I looked down at the women who had ruthlessly tormented me for decades. I did not feel angry anymore. Anger requires precious energy, and I refused to give them another ounce of my soul. I kept my voice perfectly level, letting the absolute finality of my decision echo through the hollow vaulted ceiling of their stolen mansion. I reminded them of the cruel ultimatum they had delivered when they demanded I sign the fabricated confession. You told me that if I did not sacrifice myself to save Todd, I was no longer a part of this family. I paused, letting the heavy weight of their own toxic words settle permanently over them. You were right, I said, my tone ringing with absolute certainty. I am not. I turned my back on them without a single ounce of hesitation. The sound of their frantic weeping grew significantly louder as I walked toward the heavy mahogany front door, but I did not look over my shoulder. I stepped out into the cool evening air, leaving the heavy baggage of my past behind me on that expensive carpet. As I walked down the long circular driveway toward my car, I felt an incredible, beautiful lightness spreading through my chest. The suffocating chains of familial obligation were finally broken. I started the engine and drove away from the sprawling estate, watching the house disappear in my rearview mirror for the very last time. The justice that followed was swift and entirely unmerciful. Todd never stood a chance in federal court. The massive shadow file I had meticulously compiled provided federal prosecutors with an absolutely airtight case. He attempted to secure a favorable plea deal by testifying aggressively against his wife and mother-in-law, but the digital footprints were simply too damning. He was swiftly convicted of massive corporate embezzlement and severe wire fraud. The judge sentenced him to 10 long years in a federal penitentiary, completely dismantling his arrogant delusions of grandeur. Susan and Ashley faced their own bitter, humiliating reckoning. The federal authorities relentlessly seized every single asset purchased with the stolen Vanguard financial funds. The sprawling beachfront property was legally repossessed. The luxury sports cars were towed away in broad daylight while their wealthy neighbors stood on the sidewalks and watched. Their designer wardrobes and expensive jewelry collections were fully confiscated to pay back the stolen corporate money. Because Todd had eagerly provided explicit evidence detailing their willing complicity in the Shell Corporation, they barely avoided actual prison time. Instead, they were handed severe felony convictions and sentenced to years of strict federal probation. They were left absolutely bankrupt, completely destitute, and entirely shunned by the elite suburban social circles they had sacrificed everything to impress. They were forced to move into a tiny, cramped apartment, relying on exhausting minimum wage jobs just to survive their days of unearned luxury permanently erased. My own life moved in a completely different, beautiful direction. A week after the explosive confrontation in the lobby, I walked into the Vanguard Financial Regional Headquarters and rode the executive elevator all the way to the top floor. I stepped into a stunning, spacious corner office overlooking the bright city skyline. Harrison Sterling had kept his exact word. As the brand new regional director of finance, I was finally valued for my intelligence and highly respected for my unyielding integrity. The junior analysts who used to watch Todd belittle me now looked to me for genuine leadership and guidance. I no longer shrank into the background or apologized for simply taking up space. I had built a peaceful, successful life completely free from the toxic shadows of my past. If you are watching this and you have ever felt trapped by the cruel expectations of people who are supposed to love you, I want you to know something incredibly important. You do not owe your life to anyone who treats your existence as a burden. Setting healthy boundaries is never a betrayal. Walking away from relentless abuse is a courageous act of survival. You absolutely deserve to be surrounded by people who respect your truth and value your heart. Thank you so much for staying with me until the very end of this journey. If my story resonated with you today, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. I would love to connect with you, so drop a comment below and let me know exactly where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. Remember that your inherent worth is never determined by those who blindly refuse to see it. Take care of yourself. As I sit here today looking out the expansive floor-to-ceiling windows of my new corner office, watching the busy city move far below me, I often find myself reflecting on the invisible chains that held me down for nearly 3 decades. It is incredibly strange how quickly a lifetime of heavy emotional conditioning can simply wash away once you finally decide to open your eyes to the truth. For years, I honestly believed that the crushing anxiety, the constant apologizing, and the desperate need to make everyone else comfortable was just my natural personality. I thought I was simply a quiet, accommodating person who naturally faded into the background because I did not deserve to take up space. But looking back now, I realize that I was not born to be a stepping stone for other people. I was meticulously and intentionally molded into one by the very people who were supposed to protect me. If you are watching this right now and you have ever felt like the designated shock absorber for your toxic relatives, I want to talk to you directly about a psychological dynamic called the family scapegoat. It is a very specific, incredibly damaging role assigned to the most empathetic person in a dysfunctional household. The family scapegoat is never chosen because they are weak or inherently flawed. In fact, it is usually the exact opposite. They are chosen because they possess the emotional depth, the independent thought, and the moral conscience that the abusers completely lack. Growing up, my mother and my sister realized very early on that they could effortlessly project all of their own insecurities, all of their failures, and all of their toxic behavior directly onto me. They systematically conditioned me to believe that my only inherent value to the world was my blind usefulness to them. If I was not actively solving their problems, hiding their mistakes, or absorbing their explosive anger, I was treated as a worthless, frustrating burden. When you are raised in that kind of relentless emotional war zone, you quickly learn to shrink yourself. You learn to silence your own voice because speaking the absolute truth only brings severe punishment. You become an expert at reading the shifting moods of the room, constantly adjusting your own behavior just to avoid another screaming confrontation. You carry their heavy emotional baggage so long that you forget what it feels like to stand up straight. But the most insidious part of this childhood trauma is what happens when you finally leave the house and enter the professional adult world. That deep psychological conditioning does not just stay confined to family dinners and holiday gatherings, it bleeds directly into every single aspect of your career. Workplace bullies like Todd possess a dark, terrifying radar for unresolved trauma. They can walk into a crowded corporate office and instantly identify the exact person who is raised to absorb the blame. They intuitively know who will work 60-hour weeks without ever asking for a promotion or a simple thank you. They know who will quietly fix the glaring accounting errors, who will absorb the toxic corporate stress, and who will desperately try to keep the peace at all costs. Todd recognized the perfect scapegoat in me the very first day he walked through those double-glass doors at Vanguard Financial. He eagerly exploited the exact same psychological buttons my mother had installed. He used the very same manipulative tactics, the aggressive, unreasonable demands, the manufactured daily crises, and the constant underlying threat of professional ruin. He honestly thought I was an easy target because my entire life history suggested that I would eventually break and simply accept the fall. But here is the absolute most important lesson I learned through this entire agonizing ordeal. Setting boundaries is not a betrayal of your family or your professional obligations. Setting boundaries is an absolute act of basic human survival. We are constantly socially conditioned to believe that blood requires infinite forgiveness, that loyalty means letting people walk all over you, and that keeping the peace is always better than rocking the boat. That is a dangerous manipulative lie designed to keep you permanently trapped in a cycle of endless abuse. When people explicitly show you through their actions that they view you as completely disposable collateral damage, you must believe them the very first time. You cannot change them with your unconditional love. You cannot fix them by endlessly sacrificing your own mental health or your personal freedom. The only thing you can do is silently acknowledge the harsh reality of who they truly are. And then you must quietly, passionately, and meticulously build an exit strategy they never ever see coming. When I was downloading those offshore financial files late at night in that empty corporate office, my hands used to shake uncontrollably. I was so terrified of being caught by the man who held my career hostage. But every time I felt that fear, I reminded myself of the profound disrespect my family had consistently shown me. I let their profound cruelty fuel my silent determination. The exit strategy is not just about leaving a bad situation. It is about permanently shifting the power dynamic, so they can never drag you back into their toxic orbit. You do not need to scream or shout to take back your power. True power is incredibly cold, silent, and backed by undeniable solid proof. It is walking away from the burning bridge without ever looking over your shoulder. Today, I am completely free. I do not carry the heavy, suffocating weight of my mother's cruel expectations. I do not live in the dark shadows of my sister's unearned luxury. I do not cower in the presence of arrogant corporate bullies. I stand firmly on my own 2 feet, running my own life with the quiet, steady confidence of a woman who has walked through the absolute darkest fires and emerged completely unburned. Now, I want to turn this conversation over to you because I know I am not the only person who has survived this kind of emotional battlefield. Have you ever been forced into the role of the scapegoat in your own family or at your place of employment? How did you finally find the courage to draw the absolute line and take back your life? Please tell me your story in the comments section below, because I read every single one of your messages, and your incredible stories of survival continue to inspire me every single day. If my journey brought you any value, any comfort, or any validation today, please do me a huge favor and hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another story about finding justice and taking back your power. And before you go, please let me know exactly where you are watching from and what time it is there right now. It is always so amazing to see this wonderful community connecting from all around the entire world. Until next time, please remember your inherent worth is not defined by those who stubbornly refuse to see it. You are incredibly strong, you are worthy of respect, and you are absolutely enough. Take care of yourself.